7 years after the conclusion of Deathly Hallows Part 2, the dust has settled on the beloved Harry Potter films, and the legacy left behind is quite a fond one. Many don't believe this to be a masterful series on the whole, and there are a substantial amount who dislike certain liberties taken throughout. But something to commend these films on is that they are widely regarded to be pretty good. And while this may come off as condescension, this is not a veiled slight on the series in any sense. It is tremendously difficult to adopt such a beloved series of books while having such a litany of destabilizing changing circumstances throughout the years and deliver a completed series of films that are, by and large, consistent and satisfying. 10 years of nearly non-stop production, trying to maintain an identity despite having 4 very different directors for 8 films, having to deal with rapidly growing child actors whose physical and intellectual development gave the series an imposed deadline of sorts, maintaining the feel of the series while gradually evolving to keep things fresh, the sheer amount of ground to cover in the bigger books of the series. Despite major backing from Warner Brothers, it's an achievement in itself that the series didn't run out of steam by the end and vastly disappoint. Now, as someone who has read the books back to front numerous times in my childhood, I am well aware of the many missteps and flaws that these movies have, and I will get into a lot of those. Perhaps I will end up being a little too critical in some instances. But I am also aware of the great strengths that are part of the reason that Harry's journey still grasps hold of so many to this day. As such, great value can be derived from examining exactly how the series evolved and developed as it progressed, in thematic, tonal, and directorial terms. Here, I will be examining each entry in the film series, discussing brief background information, the themes of the story being adapted, the tone and direction, the strengths and weaknesses of each entry, how they contributed to the complexion of the series, and more. I will obviously be including a lot of my personal opinion in here, but I will hopefully give enough reason and justification for that opinion to help you understand why I think that way, even if you may disagree. Note that I will alter my approach as this video goes on and as we work through the films. In the beginning, I will speak in general terms about the strengths and weaknesses of the adaptations, and as the movies start to take more creative liberty, I will get into more specific critiques, ending with chronological examinations for the final 2. I will discuss the same elements in each film, but there will not be a strict template to go by for each one, so expect some variation in the structure of these critiques as we go on. As one would expect, the story of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is very much about setting the groundwork in basically every aspect of storytelling, as the first entry of any long-running series must naturally do. Characterization establishment, world building, tone, and more must be laid down, and as a result, Philosopher's Stone is primarily about entering a new phase of life, forming connections, danger, and perhaps most importantly, discovery. The tone is light and almost fairy tale-like in its splendor, and this is entirely appropriate given that Harry is an 11-year-old discovering such a variety of new and awesome things. But apart from that tone, the film had to establish an identity straight from the beginning through its cast. Understandably, for a series that was projected to run for 7 films at minimum, much care was put into casting the ideal actors for each role. Then-children actors Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint, Emma Watson, Tom Felton, and Matthew Lewis seemed to perfectly capture the spirit of their respective characters, being able to compensate for their lack of experience with a genuinely great feel for their role. Meanwhile, Robbie Coltrane was brilliant as Hagrid, bringing a great mix of gruffness and heart that really defines the character. Richard Harris, while being a bit too reserved and soft-spoken for my liking, was great as an introductory Dumbledore, a caring figure so wondrous and enigmatic, capturing the image and charm of the character. For me personally, he was a little too perfect, for lack of a better term, not really showing off much of the quirk and eccentricities of the character, nor the very slight underlying darkness. But the direction that he went in here, likely as a collaborative intention from all those involved, is very fitting for the most innocent and wondrous entry of the series. Alan Rickman was cast as another of the major characters in Professor Severus Snape, which ended up being one of the very best decisions made.
Mr. Potter, our new celebrity.
Meanwhile, others like Dame Maggie Smith and Julie Walters excelled in their minor roles, with Ian Hart being serviceable as Quirrell and the Dursleys being cast quite well too. Casting was phenomenal, ranging from extremely fitting youth to celebrated British talent, and much credit has to be given for that. Chris Columbus was given the director's chair, and combined with a screenplay adapted by Steve Kloves, went with an approach that, while almost ethereal in feel at times due to the focus on discovery, really didn't take too many creative liberties. The original novel, being the shortest entry in the series, is just small enough to ensure that a 2.5-hour movie would be able to follow it faithfully without feeling stagnant. As such, the script was extremely faithful for the most part, following the book very closely. This led to an approach that, apart from a few big moments, concerned itself more with presenting the story through great realization, acting, dialogue, and tone, more than out-of-the-box filmmaking techniques. This approach has to be commended with regards to ensuring that the story remains effective through plot loyalty, but from a creative standpoint, it leaves quite a bit to be desired, and doesn't really take advantage of the medium. The visual directing really isn't much to speak of, with the scene composition, angling, and camera movement remaining pretty unambitious and not communicating much, at least not much that I could prize out. There are some great moments of directing and cinematography, such as the first moonlit view of Hogwarts Castle from the boats, or the exceptionally shot Quidditch matches, along with a few other iconic moments. But all in all, this film is much more concerned about drawing the audience in through plot, character development, and atmosphere than it is about genuinely saying something through visuals, which is a bit disappointing. Part of this is due to set design, which is great but lacking a little bit in cohesion. In isolation, certain locations are absolutely beautifully realized. Diagon Alley, the Great Hall, the Grand Staircase, the Gryffindor Common Room. I've always been a bit weirded out by the fact that there's no bathroom in the Gryffindor Common Room, but regardless, it looks wonderful. So much detail and care went into bringing these areas to life, and so much credit has to be given to this film for realizing them, especially as they're all very important locations that would be used throughout the series in many contexts. But that aside, there is a bit of a problem here. Hogwarts itself is supposed to be as much of a character as anyone else, and while the castle is shown to be beautiful in establishing shots, we don't really get to know it as well as we should, due to the approach taken. We see the castle. We know where it is with respect to the surrounding structures such as the lake and Hagrid's hut, but we are not given anything more than a general gist of how everything within the castle is laid out. The students enter from the boats into some sort of large staircase, and then enter the Great Hall through a door from there, but we are not shown how. They then leave the Great Hall, but we don't see it, as the next scene takes place in the Grand Staircase. We then cut to a hallway leading into the Common Room. There is no dynamic camera work or layout establishment to communicate just how these areas interact. How are they actually connected? We may have an idea, but all we are shown is 4 sets in sequence without any visual hint of a connection between them. For example, in one sequence of scenes we have classroom set, Great Hall, courtyard, some hallway leading to a classroom, etc. Obviously, this need not have been shown in great detail, but a little sense of where these areas are located with respect to one another would have gone a long way. We are just shown characters leaving one set and entering a separate one with no flow. It becomes clear that these scenes were shot in a vacuum, with the intention of simply telling the story rather than immersing the watcher. It undoubtedly feels like a series of individual set pieces rather than a genuine, connected castle, and this may seem like a dumb nitpick, but in a series where the castle is as much of a living being as anything else, a sense of cohesion is essential for making the audience feel like this place is real. The filmmakers may have had a good idea of how Hogwarts is laid out, but they don't communicate that well within the film, and this leads to a disconnect between the world being displayed and the viewer. Also, the live paintings that are a staple of the series are lively but inhumanly graceful or sullen, with very little imperfections. In essence, Hogwarts is well realized in establishing shots and within scenes, but sorely lacking in cohesion and personality. And without a distinct sense of geography, visual flair is stifled. As a director in the moment, you're given limited options of what to work with, buffering your ability to make the film visually interesting and limiting the accentuating effects of camera work. There just isn't too much of a distinct sense of a visual direction or identity. As a result of this, the film feels a little uninspired visually. It doesn't feel like those involved were able to demonstrate a meticulous understanding of the environments they were working with and how that can translate into film, and as such, it all feels kind of stale. However, Philosopher's Stone goes a long way towards making up for these problems through truly capturing the spirit of the book in other ways. The opening scene is really quite stunning, and it almost exactly mirrored what I expected going into it. The backstory of Harry's parents and the fear of Voldemort is exactly what it needed to be, providing a dark undercurrent to the events of the story, despite however many cheerful or exciting things may have been happening on screen. John Williams composes a terrific musical score which is so good that at times it carries scenes on their own when the visuals are not enough to prop them up. It is the primary contributor to the sense of tone that this movie has. It has this consistent feeling of magic, which is exactly what was needed, propelling it into iconic status almost immediately through tracks like the famous main theme. It has great variability, from whimsical, quirky stuff to the grand orchestral pieces to sinister threat. And in conjunction with the score, in general, Columbus's first entry does quite well in ushering in this world, establishing the new, and most importantly, darkly foreshadowing the unknown and the ever-looming threat of Voldemort. The little bit of what we see from He Who Must Not Be Named here is fantastic. The voice is spot on, the face is scary, and there is an aura about him. It is genuinely great, and arguably better than the actual Voldemort we got. But more on that later. Quidditch is very well realized, several important scenes from the books are beautiful, the cast are very good at establishing emotional ties between the characters effectively and genuinely, and Daniel Radcliffe's good-natured innocence is a lovely encapsulation of what this series started out as with this entry. Full of wonder and a decent amount of charm, with just a little hint at some underlying darkness. It's very well established that Hogwarts is Harry's new home, and that he has truly found solace within it. What Philosopher's Stone doesn't quite achieve in terms of vision and directorial excellence, it makes up for with spirit, terrific establishment, and heart, and overall, it was a very solid entry to the series that hooked most audiences from the off. The second entry of the series was one intending to build on the foundation of Philosopher's Stone while also introducing some darker concepts. With plot points such as the bits of aristocratic racism we see, the looming threat of petrification and death, Parseltongue, Hagrid's Ark, and the chamber itself, the direction is clear. If Philosopher's Stone's main theme was to tell about the wonders of discovery, Chambers' intent was to display the flip side of that. How scary the secrets looming in the darkness can be. The goal here was to maintain the style that was brought about from the Philosopher's Stone, but at the same time, take the series in a darker, more mature trajectory. Casting was quite good once again, with the significant additions having a great understanding of their respective roles. Christian Coulson's Tom Riddle exudes intuition and interpersonal intelligence, but there is an indescribable darkness to his character, a little something in his looks and his voice that hints at an underlying evil before he makes that more blatant. Mark Williams was very appropriate as the odd but lovable Arthur Weasley, Kenneth Branagh was the right mix of pompous and hilarious as Gilderoy Lockhart, Toby Jones does very well as Dobby, who was quite well realized, Robert Hardy is exceptionally good as Cornelius Fudge, and Jason Isaacs was impressive through his malevolent portrayal of Lucius Malfoy. Everyone else fulfilled more or less the same roles as they did before, with Bonnie Wright doing pretty decent in her increased role as Ginny. We'll be talking about her quite a bit later on. Christopher Columbus saddled up as director for the second and last time here. He has since admitted that Chamber of Secrets really stretched him thin, and he found himself having to take a step back due to exhaustion, stress, and simply wanting to spend more time with his family. Unfortunately, this shows in certain aspects of the film. Chamber feels a bit bloated, a little too long for its own good. It is more or less following the novel to a T, but that is part of the problem, and that is why creative liberty is necessary sometimes when adapting source material. You may have needed to play the Quidditch match to make sure that Harry broke his arm, to make Lockhart turn his arm into jello, to ensure that he'd be in the hospital to hear more exposition from Dobby, and find out that the chamber had been opened, but it's not illegal to change that sequence of events to better serve the pacing of the story. That scene is just an example, and in isolation, these sequences don't seem too bad or too long, but add up so many sections of story that are a bit too directly taken from the books, and it makes the film seem like a bit of a chore. Certain scenes go on for longer than they need to, others should have been shifted around or omitted for a better flow. Some story structures just work well in one medium and not in another, and in my opinion, we see that with the adaptation of Chamber of Secrets. Steve Kloves was the writer here again, and it is not clear if Columbus would have been able to improve on the script were he not so stressed out, but it certainly did not help. For a lot of the major scenes, the film opted not to use CG to carry an air of authenticity. The basilisk is partially a large puppet of sorts, Aragog is an animatronic machine used for the film, and the Whomping Willow is as well. So much respect has to go out for the work taken to make these elements feel and look real. It works, and it does feel genuinely organic. In terms of cinematography and directing, there is a general slight improvement. Scenes have a bit more dynamism to them, more interesting composition, and more fluidity in sequences. There is also a better sense of the interconnectedness that I criticized in Philosopher's Stone, and it is a bit easier to see how certain parts of the castle work in logical sense with relation to others. This establishing shot of the greenhouse is a great example of this, as is the final scene in the film that pans out from the Great Hall. This all may have been due in part to the addition of cinematographer Roger Pratt to replace John Seale, though it's a bit hard to tell. However, note that while this is all a relative improvement compared to the first entry, the composition and directing is still a bit too stiff for such a vivid series, and the castle is still far too lifeless. It's often been postulated by critics that the first two films feel a bit like a stage play, and that sentiment is due in large part to the uninspiring visual direction. There is also quite a bit of silliness, such as the direction they took with humor, a lot of which just involved Rupert Grint pulling funny faces and squeaking, and the weird bit where Lucius Malfoy literally tries to kill Harry right outside Dumbledore's office. However, structural and directorial issues aside, this is not a bad movie, and there is still quite a bit to like in Chamber. John Williams' score is once again a highlight. Fox's theme is particularly a favorite of mine, and the soundtrack in general maintains the same magical feel, but underscores a bit more darkness as a natural progression. The Weasleys' home, the Burrow, is so incredibly well realized and a great piece of set design and imagination. The bonds between the characters are further strengthened, and the lore and world building opens up decently as well. And while all of that is just a natural byproduct of such a faithful script adaptation, it is presented very authentically and naturally. Hogwarts life has progressed a tad from being wondrous and new and exciting to a life that is a bit more mundane, which is to be commended because it would strain credulity if Harry didn't habituate to his surroundings. This also helps to contribute to this slightly darker trajectory. They really nail the creepy tone throughout that gradually heightens as people are continuously attacked, and it all hits a peak with quite a good climax, some revelatory information on Voldemort, and a very, very well realized, pretty awesome looking basilisk. Chamber of Secrets definitely isn't helped by having to adapt what I would consider the weakest book in the series, but it all comes together in the end to form an okay film that, while a bit disappointing for me personally, does its job in telling an important part of the story and evolving the complexion of the series to something just a little bit darker and richer. However, 2 entries down and more than 5 hours into the series, nothing had quite captured the living, breathing, flowing world that the series takes place in. I very much admire and appreciate Chris Columbus's first two films for laying the foundation through some brilliant casting, set design, and establishing of the series' magical tone, but in terms of taking advantage of the medium, Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets stumble pretty badly. Nothing had really nailed Harry Potter as a film series with a serious, well-executed vision, apart from simply telling a story. Nothing yet. Note that at this point, the individual critiques will get quite a bit longer and more elaborate. The first two films are extremely loyal, and not very abstract in terms of production, but I have much more to discuss with the next 6 films of the series in terms of theming, aesthetics, direction, stylistic elements, strengths, weaknesses, and more. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban marked a pretty drastic change in style and focus for the series. Whereas the previous 2 novels were concerned with foundations, Prisoner of Azkaban took on an independent, thematic narrative of its own now that the introductions were finished. Though it does set the stage for future events, it is bold and strong enough to be the entry with arguably the most thematic identity in the series. Harry is used to Hogwarts and magic. He is not amazed by this world anymore. And now is the time to find his place within it and begin to mature, to face his insecurities and inhibitions, to reflect on his past, but at the same time, move forward. While the whole series is essentially a coming-of-age tale, Azkaban is a mini coming-of-age within the grander coming-of-age. Some big changes had to be made for Azkaban in terms of staffing. Christopher Columbus wisely decided to retire from the director's chair and take a back seat into the role of producer, and Alfonso Cuarón was given the job. It was a bit of a left-field decision, given that Cuarón had been known for his strange and more abstract work, but his artistic merit was not to be doubted, and he had worked on plenty of coming-of-age material, so the risk was deemed to be well worth it. And it ended up being one of the very best decisions made, because from minute 1 of Azkaban, the series was comfortably changed for the better from a creative standpoint. In terms of new characters, there were some huge personalities to cast. Due to the sad death of Richard Harris after Chamber of Secrets, a new Dumbledore was needed. Michael Gambon was chosen for the role, and he added an entirely different element to Dumbledore. In contrast to the soft and graceful Harris portrayal, Gambon was a little bit more direct, a little harsher. His tone of voice is more cutting, and he digs deeper into the imbishness of Dumbledore more than Harris ever did. Despite having admitted to not actually reading the books, and despite certain missteps that were taken with his character in future installments, Gambon just seems to exude a great understanding of what makes Dumbledore tick. He's darker, he's more energetic, he's stranger, and he's more equipped for the physically demanding aspects of the character that would later be a factor. In total fairness, Gambon does lack a little bit of the warmth and twinkling of the eye that Harris absolutely nailed, so it is a bit of a trade-off, and needless to say, I'm sure that either actor would have been terrific were they each able to do the entire series. But Gambon specifically was a very nice progression in tune with the increasing darkness of the series, and I think he was a great choice. Aside from this, Prisoner of Azkaban introduces 2 of the very best characters in the series, Sirius Black and Remus Lupin. The realization of these 2 characters was huge in contributing to Azkaban's innate sense of sentiment. Both are men who are weathered, scarred by the events of the past in differing ways, but both have a lingering nostalgia and an everlasting love for Harry's parents. Gary Oldman was an amazing choice for Black, being able to be terrifying when he had to be to ensure that the false villain facade worked well in the first 2 acts, but also reeling it back in the more heartfelt moments to display this indescribable sense of soul and spirituality. David Thewlis was cast as Lupin, and he exudes this aura of melancholy, a mix of genuine compassion and true sadness. His scenes with Daniel Radcliffe, where he fondly talks about his parents, are not only superbly directed and composed, but very well acted, going a long way towards establishing the heart of the film. They allow Harry to reflect on his past and use it to empower his future, and Thewlis's Lupin is a huge contributor. Timothy Spall was great as Peter Pettigrew, capturing an ideal mix of pathetic, despicable, and mischievously, underhandedly evil, and Emma Thompson was great at capturing the essence of Trelawney as well. In terms of the tone of the film, this was as close to perfect as it could have gotten by my estimation. I often tell others that the first two Harry Potter movies are great winter or Christmas films. Ones that are good to watch late at night, cuddled by the fire while snow flurries blanket the ground outside. Due to the palpable feeling of magic, the strong nostalgic sense of childhood wonder, the imagery of these children bundled in their Hogwarts scarves, and the welcoming Gryffindor common room fire, it just gives off this warm aura, something that suits the holidays. But Prisoner of Azkaban is very much an autumn film. It has this consistently sentimental aura that pervades everything, and we are never once given reason to forget that this is a very difficult and lonely time for Harry. Like summer cooling down into a contemplative autumn, the most poetic and quiet scenes characteristically reflect on Harry's past, before always turning attention to the seemingly cold, scary future ahead of them. As we'll get into in a minute, the majestic, flowing cinematography and directing by new cinematographer Michael Saracen and Cuarón respectively is reminiscent of a beautiful October day or a cold, stormy night, and the louder, more iconic and vibrant set pieces, well, just try and tell me that this doesn't remind you of Halloween. Cuarón builds on the magical tone, but turns it into something more grounded to form a deliciously dark, quirky, and charming atmosphere that suits the series, and this specific entry to a T. For me, this seasonal comparison is the best way to describe the tonal and atmospheric differences between the first two films and this one. Chamber was a dark progression from Philosopher, but this was the first step towards truly growing up for the series. Not betraying the feel of the first two entries, but ensuring that it evolved in a significant way. This mischievous, more unhinged tone is established through quite a few elements. John Williams' new score is a progression once again, staying true to the series' musical roots and heart, but adding some medieval flair, some sinister, ominous tracks to keep with the darker story. Azkaban is visually quite a bit darker than its predecessors, with a lot of it taking place during nighttime or storms, and the color palette is just a shade or two darker than before. Students are seen with casual or unkempt uniforms for the first time, little bits of dark visual imagery are used, and the sheer concept of the Dementors, ugly, terrifying creatures who feed on happiness, is easily the darkest thing that the series has introduced up until this point. Several little transitional moments in between scenes add a more natural flow to things and ensure that the presence of the Dementors is always felt, to perpetuate a feeling of looming darkness while never taking itself too seriously. Not to mention, the castle of Hogwarts itself has completely grown up, and we'll get to that soon. This mature yet playful complexion on the series deftly integrates with the themes of the work as well. As I said, Cuarón's fingerprints are all over this story from the first minute, with a stronger focus on identity through theming, visuals, and style right from the off. This is articulated well in Nerdwriter's video on the film, but to sum up, since Azkaban is a story all about Harry and the nuances of him being forced to come to terms with reality, the two main thematic focuses are on the idea of growing up and the loneliness that Harry feels as he is forced to do so. And there is an uncertainty associated with these two ideas. So naturally, the film portrays this, not just through dialogue or plot, but for the first time in the series, through direction. Cuarón uses as many shots and scenes as he can to situate Harry in compositions that communicate his isolation. From the first scene, where he must work on his magic in secret, to moments of loneliness in the clock tower courtyard, Harry is very often presented in solitude. Reinforced by the use of crows as symbolic imagery for impending darkness, he feels so very alone in this world. Yet that's why the warm scenes with Lupin or his best friends, or the little slice-of-life moments of these kids just being kids, are so important. Because they remind him that he really is not alone, that he has people around him who care for him. It is a concept that is relatable to the vast majority of us, and Cuarón has this basic understanding of how intimate this is, able to ingrain it with so many elements in the film to make it so inherently personal and poetic. And on the subject of compositing and cinematography, even apart from shots communicating this theme, the film is stunning. We deftly move from brilliant, iconic shot to brilliant, iconic shot to brilliant, iconic shot, letting these moments breathe just enough for impact but never lingering too long, with a constant dynamic sense of motion through the nearly continuously moving camera. It gives this sense of momentum, and at times, forced momentum, as if time is moving a bit too fast for Harry to handle at times, as if he doesn't feel like he's ready to take the step and grow up yet. In conjunction with the isolation shots and intentional shakiness at times, the camera work and visuals tell a theme of their own. Now, related to this is an element of Harry Potter that I gave Columbus's first two films grief for: the geography and interconnectedness of Hogwarts. And I'm delighted to say that it's all great here. The layout of the castle has been completely redesigned, maybe for reasons I gave in my discussions of those two entries. Cuarón absolutely needed to have a meticulous understanding of the layout of this place because he intended to use that layout to its fullest. So they essentially started from scratch to reimagine this castle, and it was an amazing decision. Great lengths were taken to ensure that the audience came to understand Hogwarts extremely well throughout the course of the movie, consciously or otherwise. Now, obviously not every nook and cranny of the castle is explained or shown, but it is miles better than before. For the first time in the series, we have a genuine understanding of how the Great Hall actually leads into the Gryffindor Common Room. Some simple shots establish that the students simply walk out, go to the left, up a small staircase before reaching the grand staircase, from which they get direct access to the common room. Also, the scenes with the Whomping Willow are not just done for charm or to show off the changing of seasons. They habituate the audience to how this place is laid out. The very first one with the bird, for example, introduces the most important areas in the film, quickly showing us that the clock tower leads to the courtyard, from where you cross a bridge to reach the Standing Stones and Hagrid's hut, behind which you can see the Forbidden Forest, which houses the lake. This perspective correlation is further reinforced in future scenes, where we see Hogwarts in the distance as the trio go to Hagrid's class. It's simple, effective, and integrative, further compounded by Harry's use of the Marauders map. And this geography is used to utmost effect for theming as well. Whether it be how the clock tower thematically integrates with Harry and Hermione's race against time in the climax, and Harry's growing feeling that time is going too fast in his life, or how the divination lessons and the connecting spiral staircase are constantly associated with a sense of gnawing anxiety for Harry, headed down a path that he has no control over. This is not just decoration. It all feeds into itself, like a mosaic. Ambitions like this would not have been able to be achieved without an honest sense of layout. Try to imagine this film, or any of the films after it, but with the Hogwarts of the first two entries instead of the one established in this one. It just loses so much cohesion, and that demonstrates more than ever how important it was to stop improvising and actually put together a fully realized castle. Related to this, Hogwarts is more full of life than ever before. The ghosts don't just stand and talk now. They go on hunts and horseback ride through the entrance hall. They're sleepy, they're lazy, and they walk through people. The paintings are grumpy, loud, or obnoxious, actually acting like human beings instead of sugar-coated, moving, graceful statues. The Whomping Willow is almost entirely computer-generated now, and it has a temperamental personality of its own. Combine this with everything else, and Hogwarts is finally what it should be. A cohesive, genuine platform for the story instead of a bunch of sets.
The first two films directed by Chris Columbus, a marvellous foundation. I just wonder about how you then have made this production your own.
Well, I think the core decision was to make Hogwarts, the context, a character. To make the school, everything, all the sets that you see, a living entity.
Cuarón demonstrates not just an intimate understanding of the world and how he should portray it, but an impressive knowledge of the characters and spirit of the story. He adds in these little moments that are surprisingly emotional given how brief they are. For instance, the little pant, the picture of Harry's parents dancing, accompanied by Williams's quiet, melancholic score, succinctly demonstrating Harry's mix of anger, sadness, and loneliness. The moment where Snape literally uses his body as a shield to defend the trio is extremely admirable and sad given later events. As I said, the Harry-Lupin segments develop Harry extremely well, while also peeling back the sentimental layers of Lupin. And the Buckbeak scene, one of my favorites in the entire series, perfectly captures Harry's yearning for freedom, his sheer want to reach beyond his station and find his own internal peace. Scenes like this wouldn't be possible without a cast and crew that had a comprehensive understanding of the characters, the emotions at play, and the thematic weight of these emotions. Now, I've spent several minutes gushing about Azkaban, but no work is without its shortcomings. My biggest bone to pick with this film is with the Shrieking Shack scene. What we get is great if looked at independently, with characteristically good direction and wonderful acting throughout. But it is a shell of the scene from the book, which went into extremely deep detail about the Marauders, their backstory, werewolves, Snape, Voldemort, and more. Now, obviously adapting something like that entirely would be detrimental to the film, and the scene is permeated by this great sense of urgency, but some more detail would have been nice, as that exposition dump is one of the most important in this series for giving context to the actions of so many of our characters. There are also some major plot elements that are left out, for instance, Gryffindor winning the Quidditch Cup, but I'm personally fine with these omissions. In terms of thematics, many of the things left out did not contribute too much and would actually have broken the lyrical flow in cases. This was the first book that was way too big to be adapted totally faithfully, so some major cuts were always going to be made, and I think the decisions here worked, with the exception of the Shrieking Shack scene. There are also some editing and continuity missteps here and there, but it's not a huge deal. A bit of a minor problem here is one that is hardly a flaw, but rather the first domino in the script that would lead to some pretty big writing problems later on. And that is the approach taken with Ron and Hermione. In this film, Hermione is extremely authoritative and powerful, while Ron is a bit soft and submissive.
Shut your mouth, Malfoy.
This is not a bad thing, and while it is a bit different from the books, it is basically just an alternate take that is not really much of a problem. But there was also the choice to change a line of Ron's and give it to Hermione.
If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too.
And this, while being a bit of a disservice to Ron in and of itself, was the start of a detrimental pattern that got worse as the series went on. Just keep this in the back of your mind. Additionally, at times, Cuarón bypasses character or universe logic for charm, quirk, and aesthetics. For instance, while in Hogsmeade without being given permission, Harry steals a lollipop from Neville whilst he is under the invisibility cloak. Not only is that very stupid of him to do, but he just decides to carry it around outside, visible to everyone. If he were actually licking it, it would be under his cloak and thus invisible, like the rest of him. But since it's visible, it means that Harry is holding a lollipop through his cloak, showing it to the world for no reason, while he is trying to stay undetected. It makes no sense. But it's funny and strange, and it's a visually pleasing sight having a floating red lollipop wandering around a snow-covered village, so it's worth keeping in. Likewise, Harry is an underage wizard and therefore not allowed to use spells outside of school. But the literal opening scene has him practicing magic at the Dursleys. It's a direct contradiction to the rules of the setting, but it's also a really cool opening sequence, and a subtle little double entendre that sets the tone almost immediately, so you can see why Cuarón wanted this. Also, how the hell does this crystal ball stop rolling in the middle of a staircase? Whether these logical flaws debilitate the film or not is up for debate, but what is clear is that these are not a series of mistakes. There is too much of a pattern here for that, and too many cast members with a knowledge of the universe who would have no doubt told Cuarón that these scenes operate on flawed logic. It's an intentional stylistic choice, throwing out the rulebook to a certain extent to capture the spirit and feel of the story. And I can't speak for anyone else, but to me, that is far more important and valuable than getting hung up over small logical inconsistencies. Cuarón's films are ones of vision, and that is what this series needed more than ever at this point. Azkaban is special. It just feels like an integrative achievement, something that transcends what the other films were able to do, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that the others were bad. In fact, this third entry set the platform and helped enable them to be as good as they were. It was so important for setting a precedent to prioritize the important stuff and identify a vision and theme for each film rather than religiously sticking to the books. This promoted creativity and out-of-the-box thinking, which was a beneficial move that set the standard for a lot of the better future installments. However, whether the next entry would positively build on this precedent right away was another issue entirely. Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire has the distinction of being the first book in the series that is thick enough to resemble a brick, and as you'd expect, it is one of the most important entries. It opens the world through elements like the Death Eaters and the Quidditch World Cup, and through its events, it progresses the series into truly dark territory. Harry had been in life-threatening circumstances before, but the danger is far more in his face this time. Whereas Prisoner of Azkaban was about finding his identity through the loneliness and coming to grips with time pushing him onwards, this is a story about taking charge and fighting. He may not have accepted his destiny yet because it hadn't been revealed, but Harry had learned to confront the dangers ahead of him. Needless to say, it is much more action-packed than the others due to the Triwizard Tournament, but the sheer length allows it to be balanced well with little breaks in the pace. It is the most intricate plot in the series by far until this point, and it culminates with the tragic death of a friend of Harry's and the resurrection of Voldemort, so the adaptation needed to be one capable of juggling these themes and bringing forth the bleakest tone yet, while being faithful and keeping a balanced flow and feel to the film despite the huge amount of action. And needless to say, it also had to develop and explore the characters. Steve Kloves stayed on as writer, Chris Columbus left entirely, and the man put in charge of directing this beast was Mike Newell. The more minor roles of Cho Chang, Igor Karkaroff, Madame Maxim, Barty Crouch Sr., and Fleur Delacour were all decent, and any complaints from me about these characters has more to do with how they were used rather than their actual acting. Miranda Richardson was quite good as Rita Skeeter, though it's a shame that due to her plotline being cut, her character hardly had any role in this adaptation. She has an ongoing conflict in the book with Hermione that leads to a resolution, but that's extremely truncated here. Stanislav Yanevsky was cast as Victor Krum, and while he has the look down, his delivery is a bit stiff.
You have no business here.
Though admittedly, this does work for the character. David Tennant does well as Barty Crouch Jr. with what he's given. I don't like the direction that the character went in here, but once again, that's a problem with the writing and direction, and I'll discuss that in a bit. Jeff Rawle is stellar as Amos Diggory, and Robert Pattinson does a very good job with Cedric as well. Very slightly pompous, but full of compassion, loyalty, kindness, and humility. He has the look nailed as well. Brendan Gleeson was tremendous as Mad-Eye Moody, energetic and unhinged enough to display the weirdness of the character, but able to add true gravity to his words when the occasion called for it. And lastly, we have Ralph Fiennes as Lord Voldemort. This is a bit of a tricky one to assess for me, and I'm going to refer to his work throughout the series here rather than just in this entry. I would never call his acting in these films bad, as he does very well with the material, but something has always seemed off about Voldemort in the films for me. He is meant to be terrifying, menacing, nearly inhuman and sinister. What we get here is just a bit lacking. He does very well in some individual scenes. For instance, his outbursts and mania in the climax of this film are quite good. But his demeanor and mannerisms feel weird. He doesn't have the necessary menacing aura and charisma, and I think this is due to a few things. Of course, this is just my opinion, so be sure to let me know your thoughts on this as well. Firstly, he just looks too human. Voldemort is supposed to be threatening and deformed from hatred. Yet this is a guy who has slits on a slightly flatter nose and who doesn't get enough sun. He's in this awkward middle ground where he isn't similar enough to be a malevolent human, but not different enough to be completely weird and foreign. This is not scary, not in the slightest. I think if he looked permanently like he does on screen right now, it would have been much more effective. The second reason for this ineffectiveness for me is that he moves too unnaturally. Ralph Fiennes has said that he wanted to make it seem like Voldemort was unfamiliar with his body in Goblet of Fire, which is fair enough, but this stilted movement carries over to later films as well. He either doesn't look in proper control of his own body, or he looks like he's paying too much attention to how his movement looks. But either way, it is not characteristic of Voldemort, and it is not threatening. Maybe it's just a me problem, but this doesn't look like a good Voldemort walk to me. And lastly, there's his voice. Voldemort is said to have a voice akin to a hiss, a raspy, guttural sound. But what we actually hear is too weak, too soft a touch for me.
The one, does it truly answer to me?
There is a clear intent to sound different, but it's too intentionally graceful and light. A villain like Voldemort should have a voice with weight and gravity. They achieved the right balance through his voice in Philosopher's Stone,
Harry Potter.
or in his message to the Hogwarts army in Deathly Hallows.
I know that many of you will want to fight.
But the most commonly used voice for Voldemort just doesn't vibe with me. Of course, this is film Voldemort, and it is a different take from the books, but I personally feel like he needed to feel stronger and more charismatic. It works in a sense because film Voldemort is essentially a more immature coward, but it didn't have much impact narratively, and I found myself wondering on many occasions how the hell this guy managed to get so many wizarding families to follow him. Having said that, Ralph Fiennes acts out his lines very well as mentioned, and in Goblet of Fire I think he is quite good despite these problems. It's just that the more screen time he gets, the more these problems compound for me, so that at times he is unintentionally funny. And obviously, adaptations are free to alter what they want with the source material, but it also leaves them open for intense scrutiny if something doesn't come off right. And I don't think that Voldemort was realized as well as he could have been. Overall though, once again, casting was pretty damn good. Now, with regards to the film itself, I'm going to be very blunt, and some of you may not like hearing this, but I'm not a fan. If Azkaban was 3 steps forward, this one is 2.5 back. That's not to say that there isn't any good in here, because there is some fantastic stuff, but it's all just thrown together so seemingly haphazardly that one has to wonder if there was a genuine plan for this. I will obviously explain my opinion, but what it boils down to is that it's simply too loud.
And I thought that it was a great thriller. It's like a Hitchcock thriller. And I was very convinced that it was only one film, so I was simply ruthless with the stuff that I couldn't see a way of doing.
Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with thrillers, and I sure as hell love a good one. But there are 2 problems: context and execution. Firstly, is a Harry Potter film, aside from Deathly Hallows 2, suited to being a bona fide thriller given that each entry should properly develop characters and build the world while having a strong emphasis on theming? And secondly, if the decision is made to make it a thriller, is it executed properly and does it achieve what it needs to achieve? Right out of the gate, there is a completely different feel to this film. While Evolution is good, while Goblet of Fire did need to be more hard-hitting, and while a great tone is set through a cool sequence with Nagini slithering through some skulls and gravestones, this was an indicator of the problems that were to come. The usually quiet, slowly building title music in conjunction with the now iconic Warner Bros. Logo had been replaced with a more pulsating, booming theme to set the tone right from the off, with a more robust soundtrack and the murder of an old man to boot. And the music is a good place to start here. After Azkaban, John Williams departed the series and was replaced with Patrick Doyle. This soundtrack is not bad. In fact, I really adore a few of the tracks. But it lacks a subtlety that Williams was so good at. The tiny string sounds that indicated something ominous, the quiet flutes that feed into Harry's yearning, the gentle piano that ever so slightly accentuates the tone and mood. Harry Potter's big moments work well because of the variation and contrast between the mundane and subtle and the grand. And this soundtrack is lacking in that. Now, this composition is not entirely devoid of quieter stuff, but by and large, atmospheric tracks that characterize the earlier entries are not very commonly used here, and are instead replaced with energetic Irish jigs, booming anthems, rock bands, sweeping orchestras, and fancy waltzes. Now, like I said, I love some of these tracks, and they are all good. I am not blaming the soundtrack here, but I am criticizing the use of it and the direction that it went in, and I use it here as an example of a microcosm of the problems with this specific film. In trying to craft the atmosphere of Hogwarts and its students, Mike Newell has admitted to trying to emulate a British boarding school to capture the authenticity of this type of environment. And there are a good number of moments where he captures the awkwardness and spirit of these interactions in youth, usually revolving around the characters being put in uncomfortable situations like apologizing or asking someone out on a date. But once in a while, it just feels very forced and out of touch sometimes, purely due to the fact that so many of these interactions are just ever so slightly over the top.
It's not going to work.
Whereas Cuarón had an innate understanding of the mentality of young teenagers and was able to use that to make their interactions organic and natural, Newell's take feels very artificial at times. It's strange because he is able to capture teen spirit quite well, but occasionally it's too much, and moderation would have been advisable. That isn't to say that these behaviors are not fine in isolation, but the frequency of this in a series that is generally quite good at genuine interactions is a bit off-putting. It's just ever so slightly exaggerated in every instance, and the effects add up over time to make the whole thing feel a bit fake.
Well, you can tell Ronald...
I'm not an owl!
If there was just one or two scenes like this, then it would be fine, but so many interactions and behaviors are over the top that it adds up and leaves an impression. This isn't really a big problem in and of itself, but it's negatively contrasted by the fact that there are so few quiet scenes of character reflection to balance it out, so the impact is worsened. It's all part of my main point. The film is just too loud. Even the hair is too loud. However, I think some time must be spent acknowledging two big performances here. While Daniel Radcliffe does spend a lot of the time yelling and clenching his jaw, and his crying and emotionally intense scenes are still a bit questionable, he and Rupert Grint are the biggest contributors to the endearing teen spirit that this film does well in capturing. Harry and Ron are the encapsulation of awkward when it comes to interactions, and it is great here. The two have developed some genuinely good comedic execution too, much more effective stuff than Ron's squeaky voice and supposedly funny crying face from Chamber of Secrets. Aside from this, however, when it came to directing the actors, Mike Newell went with a more is more approach, very clearly leading to some strange bits of overacting. There is obviously the famous Dumbledore scene, which is completely out of character.
You put your name in a goblet of fire.
But this is not the only problem with Dumbledore here. Gone are the nuances of his character, the strangeness, the lighthearted tone. Dumbledore here is cold, overt, and authoritative. Newell did not understand the character well at all, and what we have in Goblet is someone lacking the spirit of Dumbledore. The higher stakes would dictate that Dumbledore is more on edge, but not enough that he would completely abandon who he is. This is also a clear direction taken with Emma Watson, who is pretty blunt in delivery as well. Hermione is at her most annoying in this film. Nagging, yelling, crying, demanding, the poor girl hardly ever looks relaxed, and it shows. To be fair, this is a logical progression for the character due to her being a young teenage girl exposed to all sorts of new experiences and stresses, but even given that, and the raised stakes of this story, it's a bit too much. It's not out of character, but it is a caricature, an exaggeration to an extent where it feels unnatural. And speaking of unnatural, on at least 2 occasions, the film shows us these contrived scenes used purely to mislead or manipulate the audience's expectations, both involving Karkaroff. The first is when we see him sneakily, obviously close the doors to the Great Hall with the Goblet of Fire inside, very bluntly implying that he's put Harry's name in. There is no other purpose to this scene. The second is when Snape opens the door during their argument, conveniently showing Harry his dark mark tattoo, just after Harry had learned about it. Though they feel forced and unnatural, done for pure manipulative purposes rather than benefiting the story, these scenes are no big deal, so I won't dwell on them. It just warranted mentioning because it all feeds into this film's artificial feel. So these issues I speak of have been relatively minor and perhaps even unfair in cases, but now we get into the biggest problems, the main reason why Goblet of Fire doesn't properly work. It's rushed, plain and simple. There are a bunch of big or dramatic scenes in this movie. The riot, the opening ceremony, the champion selection, the first task, the Yule Ball, the second task, the Pensieve scene, and the third task leading into Voldemort's resurrection. These scenes are solidly, and at times very well executed, but the problem is that a lot of the time, it feels like a sprint, rushing to get to these big moments. Most scenes in between aggressively advance the plot, and what I mean by that is that they focus solely on getting from point A to B without much attention paid to any other story element. There is no real flow to this film, with it seeming like a connect the dots of major plot points with no cohesion, rather than a harmonious narrative. With the exception of a stretch during the middle act after the first task, which is what I consider to be the best part of the film due to how it takes its time a bit more, there is hardly any levity, with so few moments of respite to balance out the action. The pacing gets genuinely terrible after the second task, after which Harry finds the body of Barty Crouch. He reports this to Dumbledore, goes inside the Pensieve, has a chat with Snape, and then we cut to the third task. We are genuinely given the impression that the third task starts a few days after the second one, when in reality it was 3 months. Not to mention, every scene in between was a dramatic plot revelation. No character is given extensive exploration, no themes dwelt upon, which is a problem in a series like Harry Potter. An encapsulation of this approach is shown in the scene at the end of the Yule Ball, where Hermione and Ron have a huge explosive fight, but that plotline between the two is completely forgotten after that. No fallout, no reflection. The two are fine with each other afterwards, and the story acts as if it never happened. Goblet of Fire is on cruise control, on a speed that is a bit too fast to be comfortable. Nothing is allowed to breathe, there is little substance and not much development, and that is not good. Because of this, Harry's growth as a character is underbaked. Ron develops a bit for sure, but there are very few moments where we actually see what's going on in Harry's head. He has a rushed talk with Sirius, where he says that he's not ready for this, but it's nothing like the talks with Lupin in Azkaban, or the moments of reflection in Philosopher's Stone. Harry develops in this story. In his mind, he goes through the mental process of accepting danger and taking up the challenge. And this is shown through bits of good acting and directing here and there, and the lines at the end show that he's grown, but we don't feel the internal struggle. Goblet of Fire is so focused on drama, plot, and action that it ends up concerning itself with being a rapid series of set pieces and fails to tell a good story, because it does not see the value of contemplation. Now, I'm very sorry to have dumped a load of negatives on you, but I have to be honest with my assessment. But with that out of the way, I am glad to be able to talk about all the things that Goblet of Fire does right. In terms of visual directing, Goblet of Fire is definitely solid. It doesn't really tell a story through visuals in the way that Azkaban does, but it is better than the first two. The camera is rather dynamic, playing around with interesting angles at times and getting into some very good shots. All in all, the visuals are full of variability and utility, using the camera to display tension and punch through close, visceral shots, a sense of fun through fast dynamism, and tragedy through long, painful exposure and close-ups. This, combined with the music, formed an atmosphere that was quite volatile, and this is a good thing. It allowed the film to transition from humor to danger without much of a problem, being able to display the duality of oppressive darkness and the happiness of finding the little joys and appreciating life in spite of it. Harry and his friends are able to be classic teenagers in this film, even with the risk of death looming constantly, and there is something quite nice about that. The interconnectedness of Hogwarts isn't really much to speak of here. The layout introduced by Prisoner of Azkaban is maintained, so it works, but since so much of the time is spent on long sequences away from the castle, Hogwarts isn't really explored too much otherwise. A notable exception is the Owlery, which is shown in relation to the rest of the castle in a really beautiful panning shot. As alluded to earlier, while this film isn't too cohesive, it does have a few very good scenes. The tasks in general are done quite well. The first one is pretty good. There are some decent action bits, the dragon looks great, and the makeup between Ron and Harry afterwards is nice. I really like everything about the Yule Ball as well. Ron dancing with McGonagall was hilarious, and the sequences where we see these young idiots trying to work out the concept of asking people out are very charming, especially when accompanied by Neville's Waltz, which is probably my favorite song in the soundtrack. The ball itself is over the top again, but I think it adequately captured the atmosphere of the occasion, as well as the developing dynamics between Ron and Hermione. The second task is very good. I think the merpeople looked great, the music was very good, and it had this mystical air about it that was very enticing. I don't know what the hell the spectators were actually watching, but whatever. The third task was alright. I do like how they added the element of human desire and darkness to it, but there were so many cool obstacles and creatures present in the maze in the book that Harry had to prepare so hard and use so much strategy to progress through it, and there's none of that here, so it's a bit of a shame. Apart from the tasks, there are two scenes in this film that I want to draw attention to for pure brilliance. By far the best two scenes for me, and among the best in the series. The first is Fake Moody's Defense Against the Dark Arts class, where the 3 unforgivable curses are introduced. The tone is spot on from the beginning. The apprehension that the students survey Moody with, his nonchalant demeanor, it's understated, low-key, and appropriate, to allow the full gravity of the unforgivable curses to really hit home. The moment where the mood completely whiplashes after Moody demonstrates how horrifying the Imperius Curse is incredibly executed. And the scene where Harry comes into focus after Avada Kedavra is demonstrated is very powerful. Capped off by a cool little bit of directing, this scene is one of the film's greatest triumphs. The second one I refer to is Amos Diggory's mourning of his son. Jeff Rowell is unbelievable, and it is genuinely disturbing to hear his pained, agonized screams as he mourns Cedric's death. The music swells, the crowd slowly realizes that something is very wrong, and the mood shifts drastically, all the while being permeated by Amos Diggory's heart-wrenching howls. This is the first scene of true mourning in the series, and it was done incredibly. I may chastise the full package of Goblet, but there is absolutely no taking away from the acting and directing in these masterful scenes. Now, due to being a one-film adaptation of a gigantic book, there is a ton of stuff that had to be left out of the final cut. There is no coverage of the Dursleys as we start off the movie with Harry already at the Burrow, which is definitely a good choice. They don't show any of the World Cup match, and go straight to the riots, which is a bit of a shame but understandable. The characters of Ludo Bagman, Charlie, and Bill Weasley are all absent here, and while understandable as they aren't vital to the story, this would lead to further problems down the line. A notable omission is Dobby, who appears in the book for the first time since Chamber of Secrets, and plays a peripheral yet significant role in the story from then on. This omission would also lead to problems. And related to this, they completely cut out Hermione's fixation on the house elf rights and her formation of the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, which is essentially the reason that a big aspect of Hermione's character was left out of the series entirely. Not only is this a shame for the series at large, but in a movie where Hermione is constantly emotional, annoyed, or angry, it would have been nice to give her some other material to add some dimensions to her role. Despite this, however, SPEW wasn't a primary element of the plot, so I do understand why it wasn't in. One change that I consider to be criminal, however, is the shallowness from which they approach the entirety of the backstory of Barty Crouch Jr. The reveal here in the book is one of the biggest and most important in the series, meticulously tying the questions and loose ends of the plot together. But here, all we get are a couple of questions answered, and that tongue quirk of his. As was the case with Azkaban, I understand that these Rowling info dumps at the end of stories are difficult to adapt properly, but this was verging on pathetic, and the plot elements associated with that explanation are dumbed down as a result. Overall, Goblet is a mixed bag. It doesn't flow well, it's over the top, and it doesn't do justice to a lot of the characters, but it captures that sense of teenage angst and awkwardness well, and leaves you with some great scenes to reflect on. I am extremely critical of the film here, but it should be stressed that I don't think it's terrible. I just think it could have been so much more. It takes an approach in polar opposite to how I think the adaptation should have been done, and I wanted to explain my take on it in the hopes that some of you could relate, come to better sort out your feelings on the film, or even just see where I'm coming from. The biggest problem is that Goblet of Fire should have been made into 2 parts. I understand that this is a stumbling block for production, especially given that the actors were rapidly aging, but it's simply what had to be done for this one. This wouldn't automatically solve everything that was wrong, but it would fix many of the problems. It would allow more time for everything, to give Harry some proper exploration, add some quiet character moments for levity and improved flow, introduce characters who would have been important down the line, and add SPEW to build the world and deepen Hermione. The overly loud nature of the entry would seem much less so, because these big dramatic scenes would be spread out across more screen time, also giving them more impact. I'm not exactly sure where the film should have split, but I do know that this entry set the series back a little after Azkaban, compromising the tonal identity that had been established. After 4 films and 3 directors, the franchise was still on unstable ground and needed to find itself. The time was ripe for yet another new director, one who would be in this for the long term to put his vision in place and see the series out until the end. Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is a massive book. Not only does it introduce a cavalcade of world-building tidbits, a long-winded yet rich plot, and a bunch of new characters, but this is arguably the book with the most focus on development and psychology. Despite being the biggest novel, this is one of the 2 stories with the proportionately lowest amount of action, but it is far from dull. It is the series' first true step into genuine adulthood, properly introducing the politics of the world, exploring the dynamics of multiple character relationships, and digging deeper into Harry's inner psyche than ever before, as he finally, truly grows up. It explores the day-to-day life in and around Hogwarts more intricately than ever before, and very much establishes that this magical world is no longer wondrous and exciting, but dark, dangerous, and corrupt. Yet at the same time, it avoids bleakness and demonstrates that these people are still full of courage, love, and a conviction to fight for what they believe in. The film adaptation needed to be one that demonstrated the inner psyche of Harry and the final desperate struggles that he goes through to become the man that he needs to be, introducing human darkness fully while maintaining the classic Potter feel. This difficult task was entrusted with David Yates. Another entry in the franchise came with another large slew of characters to cast as the series' universe expanded even further. The minor roles of Kingsley Shacklebolt and Miss Fig were fine, and I like Natalia Tena in the role of Tonks, even if her character was not given much in the way of proper material to work with, both for this film and the rest of the series. Ivana Lynch is the perfect Luna Lovegood. She nails the absent-minded yet slightly manic look, the sing-song high-pitched voice, and the strange mannerisms. She was amazing, really capturing the heart of the character. Helena Bonham Carter is also spectacular as the crazed mass murderer Bellatrix Lestrange. Brutish, violent, disgusting, immature, and mocking. She had it all nailed down here and for the rest of the series. And lastly, Imelda Staunton was cast as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher and the meddlesome Ministry agent Dolores Umbridge. And she is nothing short of phenomenal. Her malevolently sweet voice, her little giggles, her propped-up, postured disposition, they really make her detestable, which sounds like an easy thing to do given that she's racist, deceitful, and cruel, but she really had to be the most hateable character in the series up until this point. And they succeeded. Much credit should go to her effectively irritating musical theme, the visual direction, and the sound design for doing as much as possible to make her stand out as extremely repulsive in the best possible way. Happily, the overacting that plagued Goblet of Fire is mostly gone. The trend of Hermione being powerful and more authoritative than Ron continues here, and it's not really a problem in this film as it is entirely appropriate for the characters, but I just ask once again that you keep this in mind. Neville had an increased role, and Matthew Lewis does well with the more poignant stuff, though his influence is far less than in the books. His heroics and situation are not dwelt upon, and we don't meet his amnesic parents, which would have been a very welcome bit of emotional weight. Michael Gambon returns to form to an extent with Dumbledore here, not being overly harsh like he was in Goblet, but keeping the power and aura of the character, and re-establishing the charm and warmth pretty well, despite being distant from Harry most of the time. The benefits of Gambon's more imposing nature are clearer than ever in his scenes where he takes a stand against Umbridge and Voldemort. He's still a bit less nuanced than he could have been, but it's a definite improvement on Goblet. It's great to see Remus Lupin back, but his role is extremely reduced. He's not given much purpose other than providing news about the Ministry. He looks shabbier than ever, and it would have been nice to just have a minute to catch up with him in his situation, to have Harry connect with one of the most influential people in his life. Fudge is given his most substantial role in the films yet, and he is narrow-minded, naive, and furiously good. He's great to hate in this film, and a true personification of the problem with the Ministry and the concept of political posturing for public perception in the face of strife. And lastly, Gary Oldman is wonderful, and contributes to some fantastic serious scenes. We see the glimpses of compassion and sadness from the past that were present at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, and he is full of yearning for a better life. The pure hatred of his family is unfortunately underplayed, but it's clear that at heart, all this man wants is a new family to care for, and he and Harry complete each other. It's a great performance full of heart, and it makes his death at the end even more sad when it suddenly happens. Nicholas Hooper was the new composer for this one, and while his entry isn't as strong as anything Williams put out, it did well in recapturing the quiet melancholy that was missing from Patrick Doyle's Goblet of Fire. The tracks in general have a similar tone to the first three entries, with a comparative lack of memorability and punch. But funnily enough, this actually benefits the film, as it is an entry intending to move into more serious and mature territory, and a more understated soundtrack is a good fit for that. The directing here was nothing incredibly fancy, but it did contribute to the narrative. Since a lot of this film is about Harry purposely isolating himself through frustration and internal conflict, as opposed to genuinely, passively just feeling isolated like in Prisoner of Azkaban, a good few shots communicate that, through centering Radcliffe in the frame in high focus. Like he is shutting himself off from everyone and everything else, and going too deep within himself for comfort. It is not really carried out to the fullest extent in the film, but it is a very interesting stylistic direction. In general, Yates's and cinematographer Slawomir Idziak's approach here is serviceable. There are some very good shots here and there, and some decent composition, but nothing is too ambitious or artistic, similar to Goblet of Fire. Seeing as this was his first entry, Yates seemingly used Order of the Phoenix to dip his toes in, before going for a bolder artistic vision later on. There does seem to be a bluish filter and color palette over a substantial amount of the scenes. I don't know how else to say it, the film is very blue. I'm not sure what this is supposed to signify other than tying the film together visually and giving it a consistent feel. The tone here is not really set, but one that is intentionally constantly shifting, as the world and events Harry sees changes his mentality. The music swings from ominous to optimistic, the shots go from very bright and warm to extremely dark and cold within a short period of time. It's an integration between theming and tone, the volatility and perspective of youth, a contrast and constant tug-of-war throughout between seeking joy and dwelling in darkness. And this is encapsulated right from the off. Initially, Harry feels hopeless and despaired after he is expelled due to the Dementor attack, accentuated by a nice little touch of using the photograph from Prisoner of Azkaban, the broken glass cleverly foreshadowing the future revelations about James cracking Harry's idealized perception of his father. But soon after, the Order comes to save him, and he is having the time of his life on his broom. I don't understand why they decide to race through Muggle cities and in plain view of people in boats and stuff, but I don't really care. It's a nice sequence and a microcosm of the film's approach to tone. They also did some things with the editing. Along with a pretty big emphasis on flashbacks to previous films for the purpose of emotional context within scenes, we now have transitions to signify time passing through the montages with the Daily Prophet, the Wizarding World's main newspaper. And I do like the creativity here. The montages of goings-on within the castle that were integrated with these were great too, and often signified the mood of the story. The first one with the newspapers gave an impression that Hogwarts was being oppressed, and the mood was quite somber. The second one consists of some dynamic camera work, swiveling and following Harry as he teaches his lessons, giving a sense of enthusiasm and energy, like he is beginning to find himself again. It is about the students fighting back, growing relationships, and getting confident in themselves, so the tone was much more hopeful. The third one is a hammer blow, covering the Azkaban breakout, and the fourth one caps off the story at the end. It was all well done, and a nice way to keep the plot flowing along while integrating world building and tone. The film is at a brisk pace throughout, always having a sense of momentum against this constant oppression, yet having the intelligence to allow for some levity as well. Thankfully, those quiet, melancholic character moments are back, and they are a wonder for actually developing these characters. Harry Potter is, first and foremost, a character piece, and though we take a break from properly exploring the psychology of our characters in Goblet of Fire, Order of the Phoenix puts us back on track. The film in general is adapted quite well. Steve Kloves was replaced with Michael Goldenberg as the scriptwriter for this one, and it resulted in a screenplay that knew where it wanted to place its cards. Certain things are left out, like Neville's parents, details about the state of wizarding society, Quidditch, and a lot of the day-to-day school stuff that are a big factor in the book. Also, Dobby continues to be absent when he was actually a factor in the books, which is, again, notable. Now, I love reading about that stuff, but apart from the scene with Neville's parents, it works that it is cut, because it is all peripheral to the story that this is trying to be. One mainly focusing on finding the light despite personal struggles as it pertains to Harry and Hogwarts as an entity against Voldemort and the political posturing of the Ministry. Anything tangential to that is understandably left out. That doesn't mean that it was faultless, however. For instance, the memory scene with Snape is a bit too quick for my liking. I think for such an important continuous plot thread that they should have added more to the scene and dwelt on it a little bit longer to really hit home. And though some brilliant acting from Rickman allows the moment to stick the landing and have impact, the aftermath of this is basically non-existent. In the books, Harry has a very good chat with Lupin and Sirius about his insecurities and feelings about his dad, and while they admit that it's a complicated topic, they ensure him that his dad grew past his flaws and became a great man. It's a very nice scene, and I wish it was in the movie. It would have deepened Harry as a character and given Lupin something more substantial to do, to maintain his heartfelt role from Azkaban. Also, there are some weird decisions and prioritizations. The character of Grawp, for example, is used as a means to derail Umbridge in the climax, and that is all. He isn't revisited in the series, and he has very little role here other than showing Hagrid's caring nature, which we already knew about, so it's a wonder that he's in here at all. Some other device could have been used against Umbridge in the climax, and the time spent on the Grawp scene could have been for something more useful. That isn't to say that this scene is bad. I actually think it's pretty funny and cute. But it just doesn't serve much of a purpose, considering the role that Gropp actually has in the movies. Having said all that, you would think that cutting the longest book into the shortest movie so far would be a huge mistake, but this works for the adaptation overall. The script does stumble, but it's mostly justifiable stuff in terms of cuts. Set design was also a big factor here. A number of new locations are explored in Order of the Phoenix, so bringing these areas to life was very important. The House of Black, Sirius's old home and the new headquarters for the Order of the Phoenix, is very well realized. It has this very effective, ominous atmosphere to it. Like it's a relic of the past, dusty and aged, weighed down by time and bitterness. And aside from this, both the bustling Ministry of Magic and the eerie Department of Mysteries look great and work extremely well as a display of the unnatural. A direct visual contrast to the wizarding world that Harry has come to know, and as such, a faction that we, as watchers, subconsciously feel at odds with just from a visual standpoint as a result of how different it looks from areas like Diagon Alley and Hogwarts. And on a somewhat related note, the Thestrals are awesome. They needed to be something that seemed menacing at first, but got more majestic and beautiful the more you look at them. The design chosen for this film fits the bill perfectly. It's a great little addition to the lore of the world, and an emotional, thematic parallel to Harry's state of mind in the story. In terms of Hogwarts geography and topography, there are some nice shots to show the dungeon's location in comparison to the rest of the castle, and some good visuals of the grounds, but a lot of it is treading the same path that we've seen in previous films. The bridge, by Hagrid's hut, the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, the courtyard. There are a few new locations, like the 7th floor corridor that leads to the Room of Requirements, the Room of Requirements itself, and Umbridge's office, which is sickeningly appropriate. But the locations are not really used as anything other than means for containing scenes, compositing, and cinematics. As far as I could tell, there is no clever use of the castle or a part of the castle to integrate into an idea of the story like Cuarón did. And apart from the Thestrals being a symbolic allusion to Harry's situation in life, none of the grounds or anything associated with them are used for theming. It's a bit disappointing, but this is more of a lack of a positive than an actual negative for the film. Getting into the approach to characterization and theming, Order of the Phoenix downplays Harry's pure anger throughout and understates it a bit. In the book, he yells and swears and fights with everyone. He's a huge dick, essentially, and it makes total sense given the huge amount of stress that he's feeling. But I think that they were a bit hesitant to make Daniel Radcliffe do that because they didn't want their main character to be unlikable. He is much more on edge and snappy than he is in previous installments, but it really doesn't do it to the extent of the books. We aren't shown just how conflicted, traumatized, confused, and frustrated Harry really is with Dumbledore and the others, and I think this dulls the impact of the film a bit. Harry says this, but the presentation could have had more impact. Related to this, the relationship between Harry and Cho is really shallow and never really contributes to the story in a way that it could have. Harry's flaws are just never exposed as much as possible, and that is a problem. One of the primary thematic ideas here is of finding the light through connecting with others, and the light at the end of the tunnel doesn't feel as bright and effective if the tunnel really isn't that dark. I do really enjoy Harry's constant paranoia, visualized through seeing Voldemort everywhere, and the little snake-like neck movements that he does to signify Voldemort's influence. The contemplative, quiet scenes that I gush about are great here for Harry, this time using Luna in a way to both develop her character and help Harry slowly come to realize that he doesn't have to be alone. His dialogues with Sirius are great ways to get into his head in that vein as well. They're really nice little touches that go a long way, and despite my issues with Harry, Daniel Radcliffe does a good job regardless of them. Not to mention, his delivery of the "look at me" line is terrific.
Look at me! What's happening to me?
Thematically, the film does itself proud when it comes to transitioning the Ministry from a neutral party into a detestable body of power through Fudge's nonsense and Umbridge's evil. Umbridge's opening speech is brilliant, establishing her as a stark contrast to everything that is enticing about Hogwarts. A foreign entity, visually and tonally, deathly sweet with ulterior motives behind every carefully planned word. The scene where they use the steps to demonstrate a power struggle and a display of allegiance is a bit in your face, but I do like it, and it's a nice moment for McGonagall as she sides with the students, further establishing Umbridge as an evil toad, as if we needed more reason. The castle itself is not full of as much personality as it had in Azkaban, but that is not a criticism, as it is pretty consistent with the maturing tone. Yet, it still has magic, undeniably. You really don't know what you have until it's gone, and as Umbridge slowly takes over Hogwarts, clearing out the paintings, shackling the students, sacking the teachers, it really is sad to see how sterile and lifeless the castle becomes. But the film situates itself in duality. While there is a lot of terrible stuff going on at Hogwarts, this is the stimulant that signals for the youth to fight back. And the Dumbledore's army segments are genuinely lovely sequences that drive home how willing these characters are to truly stand for something and defend what they care for. These people just want to be free, but the world can very quickly cause them to lose hope, so it always feels as if things can change at any second. This tonal whiplash is very effective near the climax. From the joy of seeing Fred and George's glorious escape, to being brought straight back to Earth through Harry's false vision. The actual climax is well directed, tense, and quick in pace, and it's cool to see wizards actually fighting in genuine combat. It's got punch, and it's well choreographed, definitely believable and not at all awkward. The camera continuously pans throughout the battlefield as Bellatrix's taunts punctuate the intense soundtrack and the sound of spells. It gives the whole thing a sense of immersion that short, close-up, quick cuts wouldn't be able to do. But Sirius's death happens in a flash. This is good in that it keeps in tone with how volatile the world is proving itself to be, though it might have been a bit too quick for its own good, and the impact of that specific moment is dulled a bit because Sirius is gone before you even know what happens. Dumbledore vs. Voldemort is epic and pretty cool, but a bit strange. It's much more creative than the simple beam of light fights, and it's quite well shot, but there never seems to be any tension or alternate reason for this fight other than plot, and Voldemort's antics the entire time just make him come off as erratic, goofy, and almost a little bit comedic. I really don't like his portrayal sometimes. Subsequently, the battle within Harry as he grapples between revenge and love in a pretty Star Wars-esque way is very well done. Flashbacks are used to great effect here. I don't know what these shots of Ralph Fiennes looking awkward with a soothing desktop screensaver are doing here, and I don't like the little bit of comedy that they implement with Fudge in the immediate aftermath, but overall, it really drives home how much Harry values what he has gained in these 5 years, and that he'd never change it for the world. Embracing love and rejecting the abyss of hate. It ties into the entire film thematically, and it's well executed.
It isn't how you are like, it's how you are not.
Now, I've criticized Prisoner of Azkaban and Goblet of Fire for not properly adapting these long info dumps at the end of the stories, but surprisingly enough, I'm fine with the approach in this film. Dumbledore's talk with Harry in the book is good, though it is gigantic and filled with details about the prophecy that the film decided not to address. Given that, I have no problems with cutting all the fat in this case. Simply put, Harry is the chosen one. Harry and Voldemort will face each other, and one of them will kill the other. Cut and dry, plain and simple. Some nuances lost, but it works. My last point here is about a line that was film exclusive, one that I think is terrific for the many interpretations it could spawn, and the many implications it has.
Nice one, James!
This could be interpreted in many ways, but there are two that I really like. Firstly, it can be taken negatively for Harry. That despite him growing to think of Sirius as a beloved family member, in the heat of the moment, Sirius's instinct is not to compliment Harry, but to praise James. That must sting a bit and bring up thoughts that Sirius didn't really think of Harry as his own person, but a James substitute. Now obviously he didn't actually think that way, but it would naturally bring up the question in Harry's mind. Did Sirius care for Harry partly in compensation for how much he misses James? That thought could seriously weigh on Harry. The more positive interpretation is that it really wasn't that deep. Sirius is loving being able to take a stand with loved ones again, and it brings up a nostalgia from the old days that Harry would be happy to assist with. Despite his huge flaws, James is a person that Harry thinks of fondly, and being compared with him would be a great source of pride. It's a complex little line, so maybe both of these interpretations can coexist. Either way, it really feeds into my main point here, that Order of the Phoenix is a story about family, and not just blood. About finding solace and empowerment through the ones that you love to come through the toughest spots all the better for it. That there may be a dark horizon coming, and there will be more tragedy, but like hell are we going to stand there and take it without defending what we care about. Overall, Order of the Phoenix communicates this quite well, and it was a very solid start for David Yates. Though it is lacking in richness and depth for quite a few things, it pretty seamlessly delves the series into much more mature territory without losing the roots of the story. It doesn't attempt to do anything truly radical or overly ambitious, but it keeps the series ticking over nicely. The casting is brilliant, the directing is good, the script and cuts are not perfect, but they worked. It was an emotional, well-paced work with clever integrative editing that told a tale of overcoming personal hurdles using the help of friends, demonstrating the true value of human connection. It set the series back on track and provided Yates and company with a good foundation to be a little bit more ambitious with future entries. Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince is pretty widely acknowledged to be the quietest book in the series. It is not the most contemplative entry, as that would go to Order of the Phoenix, but it is the one with the least action and the most focus on the mundane. The world is truly terrified. Diagon Alley is abandoned, students are being kept at home rather than going to school, and everyone is on edge. But in appropriate contrast, Harry has well and truly matured. Having accepted the mantle of the Chosen One, he knows what his destiny is, and he is ready to meet it. This gives the story less internal conflict from the start. There is much less angst, much less fear, much less loneliness from Harry, and he has grown in stature. As such, this allows him time to be a little more normal, to take part in the things that kids his age take part in. Relationships, love, sports, hijinks, growing further bonds, and in his case, learning about Voldemort. It's the entry that puts a meticulously increased focus on the characters of Ginny, Snape, Dumbledore, and Malfoy, providing the hook through the memories of the past that Harry and Dumbledore explore to piece together the secret to defeating Voldemort. It is a story of intrigue, of a slowly building tension as Harry learns about the Dark Lord before reaching a crescendo at the climax. And in terms of adaptation, we needed a film that, while acknowledging the terror of the situation, was able to tell a sentimental story of the past with an eye for the future, to play out a coherent mystery and allow these 16-year-olds to be 16-year-olds, even in the face of utmost danger looming, without compromising a consistently ominous tone. Yates had his work cut out for him. With the universe having capped out in terms of expansion in Order of the Phoenix, there were not too many new characters introduced, and emphasis was instead on developing or peeling back layers of established ones. But there were a few notable additions. There isn't much to say about Dave Lageno's portrayal of Fenrir Greyback, because the character was dumbed down to a big brute with the personality of a pylon. Jessie Cave does the job as Lavender Brown. Her portrayal was a bit over the top for my liking, but her acting was spot on. Helen McCrory doesn't have a major part as Narcissa Malfoy, but she's very good at capturing the essence of the desperate mother. Freddie Stroma is pompous and irritating, so he works as Cormac McLagan, and the actors cast as the younger versions of Tom Riddle in the Memories were pretty impressive. Hero Fiennes Tiffin perfectly captures the disturbing, creepy essence of 11-year-old Tom Riddle, He's unnerving, he's got a dark aura about him, and his voice is great, foreshadowing the snake-like man he would become. Frank Delane was cast as 16-year-old Tom Riddle, and he nails the charisma and charm that Riddle obtained through his years as a student. I do think that Christian Coulson does a slightly better job in Chamber of Secrets, but I still applaud Delane for his efforts here. All in all, these young actors really captured the essence of Voldemort. The final and most significant new character here was the bumbling new potions master, Horace Slughorn. Jim Broadbent does really well in the role, and he captures the duality of a character who is a good man at heart with some unsavory traits. He's undoubtedly aristocratic and elitist, but at heart, he is someone who values compassion and connection, and Broadbent was very good at that. Daniel Radcliffe is tasked here with a more mature, easygoing Harry, which makes sense given his development in the books. It is not perfect. For example, the opening scene where he hits on the girl at the diner is meant to signify that Harry is mature and confident with himself in spite of the tragedy he's been dealt, and that concept is good. But despite being better with girls in Half-Blood Prince, him being this smooth doesn't seem quite right. Despite this, I think he does very well. He was never bad at doing the more intense stuff in films 3 to 5, but being a bit more easygoing and clear-minded in this one suited him well. And his comic timing is to be applauded. This is quite a funny film, and a lot of it is thanks to the delivery of his lines.
Not to mention the pincers.
The trajectory of the directions that Hermione and Ron's characters went in began to gather steam here, and it's a little disconcerting. There's a clear dichotomy between the type of scenes that the two get. Rupert Grint gets the comedy, Emma Watson gets the more impactful, emotional stuff. Rupert Grint gets the comedy, Emma Watson gets the quiet, contemplative scenes. Rupert Grint gets the comedy, and Emma Watson gets the comedy. Even if it is a bit of a departure from who she was in the books, it makes Hermione a dynamic and very well-realized character at the expense of Ron. At this point, Ron is mainly there to be lighthearted and funny when the occasion calls for it, and quiet and submissive when the occasion calls for it. I am exaggerating for effect here, but he's essentially a mechanical tool to channel the atmosphere intended, whether that atmosphere needs to be lighthearted, ominous, or anything else. Now, I don't mean to imply that he's completely shallow or one-dimensional, because Ron does serve a lot of functions in this film, but he very clearly follows a template. He never disrupts anything, and it is always very consistent in tone and character, but it reaches a point where it shoehorns Ron a bit too much. The final scene involves Harry and Hermione talking about the quest ahead, and Ron just kind of sitting there quietly, not saying a word and just sort of looking around. Rupert Grint should have gotten some more layered material here. However, on a similar note, I need to commend the approach taken with Hermione's characterization here and in the last two films. Order of the Phoenix got rid of the overacting from Goblet of Fire, but Emma Watson really found her identity in Half-Blood Prince. Her strength is in the subtle stuff. The quiet material, the more understated looks of emotion, the little pauses and glances she gives in key scenes. They really hit a sweet spot with Hermione's character here, and I think they realized it, because she continues this approach in the remainder of the films. That isn't to say that Emma Watson does not get more impactful scenes, of course, but there is a very noticeable shift here. As I said, Half-Blood Prince puts an increased focus on characters who had, in the past, been on the periphery to differing extents. And one of these characters is Ginny Weasley, who is at her most prominent since Chamber of Secrets. Unfortunately, I really dislike the portrayal here, and it's mainly due to Bonnie Wright and the direction given to her. She has given very little help from the script, but even so, her delivery is just so bland, wooden, and boring. One of the primary aspects of Ginny as a character in the books was her extremely tenacious, fiery personality that Harry almost subconsciously began getting attracted to as time went on. Ginny should be temperamental and fierce, but except for one small scene, we don't see this at all. Of course, movies can diverge from the books and have a different take on her, but this was not very good. Bonnie Wright puts such little expression into her performance. She's far too reserved, and so many of her lines come off as awkward. Though, like I said, the writing didn't help.
Shoelace.
It all leads to a feeling of disconnect with Ginny. Her and Harry's relationship has such little chemistry, and that really isn't good for one of the main romances. On a happier note, the other actors with increased focus do exceptionally well. Michael Gambon's Dumbledore gets more screen time than ever before, and this is easily his best performance since Azkaban, maybe his best performance in the series. His warmth and kind nature, his bizarre quirks, they're all here once more, yet he feels more undeniably old and weak. Dumbledore is slowly dying in this film due to the strain put on him after destroying the Horcrux, and this is very clear. But despite that, he shows his power throughout, and the scene in the cave is one that he absolutely nails, really communicating the emotion and gravity of the situation. Half-Blood Prince is where Snape seemingly finally shows his cards, so Alan Rickman has an increased focus here. And he is awesome as usual. He adds an extra dimension of ever so slight sadness to his scenes. Whether it be in the Unbreakable Vow section, or his talk with Malfoy, or his conversations with Dumbledore, you can just tell that Snape is haunted by something. A look in his eyes, the tiniest quiver in his voice, he is stellar. One of the best scenes in the film is a deleted one, which is essentially just one long, tortured look from Snape as he prepares to do something he hates for the sake of those he loves. And it was taken out because the staff thought that the look in Rickman's eye gave away where his true loyalties lied. It is sad because it's an amazingly directed and acted scene, but it really demonstrates just how good Rickman is. Lastly, we come to Tom Felton, who is finally given some substantial material to work with in this one. As the films went on, Malfoy's perceived threat slowly diminished with each entry as the darkness of the story ramped up and the true threats emerged, until he became a bit of a pathetic annoyance. But here, we really dig into him as he is given a task that he simply isn't ready for, and doesn't want to do. He is not evil at heart, and he does not want to kill Dumbledore, and although he flaunts this responsibility as a badge of pride at the beginning, he slowly unravels, and it becomes clear that this is not him. He is pained and tortured, and it is so plain to see in his performance. His struggle and arc is one of the most impressive things about this film. Superbly written, directed, and acted. We can really feel the weight on his shoulders and his pure fear so much that it's hard to not feel a bit of human sympathy for him in spite of how much of a twat he is. Aside from the acting, Half-Blood Prince is one of the most unique pieces in the series in terms of the atmosphere, aesthetics, and the methods with which they are achieved. Yates and cinematographer Bruno Del Bono clearly wanted to be bold with this entry, applying much more abstract direction and creative liberty. This is comfortably the most innovative and interestingly directed entry since Prisoner of Azkaban, and one with a clear stylistic vision of what was meant to be conveyed, and that has to be admired. There is a very intentional move to try and let emotions fester as much as possible in these scenes, giving scenes utmost opportunity to breathe, and letting them linger just a half-second longer than you'd expect them to, leading to a sense of calm. It's an interesting stylistic choice, and it more or less stays intact for the rest of the series, which I think draws out the tiniest extra bit of emotion in these scenes, along with keeping the pace flowing smoothly. Emma Watson is very good in this aspect, with her subtler approach being given the most material with regards to this. Now, make no mistake, these lingering scenes are palpable, even if it is at the subconscious level, which gives Yates's last 3 films a slower feel at times. And that worked fine with me, but I am aware that many may not like that approach. The cinematography here is genuinely stunning. With an extreme emphasis on wide shots, this film is full of beautifully composed scenes, and it is definitely among the best in the series in that regard. There is a meticulous amount of detail and attention paid to framing, not a hair out of place. And not only are they interesting and attractive to look at, but so many of these shots are done partly to provide as much detail about the moment as possible. There is so much visual richness here, with fantastic set design on full display, and the little details do wonders for immersion. But in a departure from previous installments, instead of immersing through using this film as a perspective piece, this is mainly done through giving a full view of these situations. And, to be clear, it's not as if past films did not have these excruciating details, but these still cuts and wide shots here put more emphasis on them as a mechanism for presentation. Accented by a softer, richer palette, the color scheme is very notable for this film, for better or for worse. Nearly every scene is muted, with lots of dull grays, lifeless greens or yellows, and bland browns. Some scenes are so drowned out that you'd think that the film was being shot in black and white or sepia. This is a very clear approach taken to try and suck the magic and life out of the world, to portray that this setting is now dark and dangerous. A good example of this is if you compare the opening ceremony from earlier films in terms of coloring and atmosphere to how it looks in this one. Earlier, this ceremony was full of life, with flowing, quirky camera movement and vibrancy. But now it's slow-moving, mechanical, and it's got the atmosphere of a funeral. It's not a very subtle way to do this, and it could detract from the film for some viewers, as this constantly lifeless approach to color sometimes leaves it feeling stagnant. But having said that, you can't say that this color palette is not effective given the intended outcome, and the scenes where the film does look brighter and warmer really give off a comfy and positive atmosphere due to contrast. Half-Blood Prince's plot is formed through the collection and exploration of memories of Voldemort's youth, as Harry and Dumbledore attempt to put together the secret to defeating him. Now, while I do wish that we could have had one or two more memories in the film to properly substantiate Voldemort's past in a way similar to the books, I have nothing but praise for the actual execution and direction of these memories. The colors in these starkly contrast the muted approach to visuals throughout the film, giving them extra weight and emphasis through bold dark greens and startling whites. I also love the little details in sound design and visuals, like how the voices have a distinct echo, how you can faintly hear the screeching of the Horcruxes, or how when the scenes are finished, the most important visual details of the memories linger just a split second longer than any other element to emphasize their importance. The camera is not very dynamic at all here, but as opposed to the unambitious camera work in the first two films, I believe this to be an intentional move used for tone, atmosphere, and theming in conjunction with the cinematography and color palette. Half-Blood Prince has a very intentionally stable camera, almost reminiscent of David Fincher films, cold and robotic. Cuarón's approach to Azkaban had a human playfulness in the motion of the camera, but here it is very deliberate. And aside from how much this lends itself to some genuinely beautiful screens throughout, there are two functions for this. The first is a natural byproduct of the approach, that in order to inject life or urgency into scenes, much emphasis is on the actors. Ironically, this strips the story down and allows it to be extremely human by relying much on this. It's a bold, confident move, and the acting is quite good here, so it pays off for the most part. Now, the second function is a more tonal, thematic one. There are so many non-moving shots, and when the camera does move, it's usually very slow and even. Continuing this comparison, Azkaban had a forced sense of momentum and fluidity to add a dynamic sense of charm and reinforce the theme of time passing for Harry. But Half-Blood Prince is like a solemn lament. Time is steady here, painfully so, and our characters are forced to reflect on the state of the world as their lives feel like they are at a standstill. This leads to a tone, atmosphere, and feel of gradually oncoming, genuine dread. The visuals, the detail, the intent for immersion. This is the Potter film that banks more on its atmosphere than anything else up until this point, almost attempting to coerce the audience in and draw them into this dark world. However, Yates ensures that there is balance to this dark approach through several story beats throughout the middle act. From the scene with Harry in the coffee shop till the last moment, Half-Blood Prince is intent on ensuring the audience that despite everything these characters have gone through, they are still just 16-year-old kids. This is the funniest film in the franchise for me. From the awkward relationship navigating to Harry's escapade with Felix Felicis, it's really hilarious at times. Just because the world is going to hell does not mean that you can't enjoy the little moments, and these young people find themselves falling in love and goofing around and having fun, because in spite of, and perhaps because of the darkness around them, it is still possible to find solace and happiness through others. And this theme is clear throughout. This is comfortably the entry with the most focus on relationships and love, and it is easy to see why. But with an increased focus on these things, Yates and the returning Steve Kloves clearly felt like there was not enough action to break up the slower pace and the understated approach. As such, they added 2 action scenes that are completely original. The first is an attack that wasn't shown in the books by the Death Eaters on London Bridge and Diagon Alley. Supplemented by a quick flashback to the Order of the Phoenix, it's a decent way to establish the state of the world and show that the Death Eaters have no need to hide anymore. It's a good scene. The second edition, though, that's a different story. The attack on the Burrow was a strange decision. I get that they wanted a bit of action, but this was pointless. We don't learn anything new about the characters, the plot doesn't progress in any way, nothing changes from this, and the Burrow is perfectly fine in the next movie. If they wanted to add an action scene to change up the pace, it should have benefited or affected the story in some way. But all it does is give Harry, Ginny, Tonks, and Lupin something to do, which admittedly wasn't a bad idea given that the latter 2 are shells of their characters at this point. Other than a few lines from Arthur on how the condition is taking its toll, Lupin is hardly given anything in terms of true meat for his character. And Tonks basically just takes up space here, which is unfortunate for Natalia Tena. The 2 are shown to now be in a relationship, despite no hints to that prior, but they hardly fulfill a role. Add these problems to a script that waters down the elements I previously described and undersold the entire backstory of the Half-Blood Prince, and it's clear that there were a few problems here. But where Half-Blood Prince stumbles a bit in the script, it makes up for in packing as much emotion as possible into the moments that call for it. Nicholas Hooper's soundtrack is a real star here, adjusting his style from Order of the Phoenix to something even more understated, more foreboding, and more atmospheric, totally appropriate for the film. And in combination with the increased focus on the actors, atmosphere, and composition, we get some truly stunning beats here. The Unbreakable Vow scene is beautifully acted, intense, and strikingly shot, giving away little hints about Snape's character to ensure that his plotline is restored as an engaging hook, but not revealing too much. The scenes with Malfoy testing out the Vanishing Cabinet are haunting, as tension slowly ramps up and Tom Felton beautifully displays how much this situation is spiraling out of control. A particular highlight is a gorgeous slow panning shot of a heated conversation between a desperate Malfoy and Snape, which slowly reveals Harry listening in. And probably my favorite sequence in the film is around midway through, after Hermione pours her heart out to Harry about her feelings for Ron in sadness. Not only is it great acting accompanied by a beautifully somber track, but we then cut to a moving shot of the Hogwarts exterior, where we see the party from the loud Gryffindor common room before moving on to Ron and Lavender kissing in an empty tower, continuing to the Astronomy Tower, where Malfoy is lost in thought, pondering his situation, finally rotating to show a Hogwarts at dawn, symbolizing that an indeterminate amount of time has passed and that the dust has settled from this situation. Melancholic, atmospheric, integrative, reminding us of Malfoy's personal struggle while also working well as a transitioning moment for a passage of time. A beautiful example of how to take creative liberty from the book to benefit the story. It's a wonderfully shot scene that is a microcosm of so many character moments, but it also, once again, has a great sense of the interconnectedness that I'm so fond of, showing multiple locations with respect to one another to give the audience a sense of how Hogwarts works in areas that we haven't seen before. The Astronomy Tower in particular was a great choice to have here, as it is not only scenic, but the location where the biggest moment of the film occurs. In every scene taking place at the Astronomy Tower, the characters are in a negative frame of mind. Malfoy here, Snape later on, Harry's anxiety prior to the cave scene. It subconsciously associates the Astronomy Tower with negative feelings for the audience, priming them for the big moment. But the brilliance here is that the film ends on the tower too, with the characters in a positive and determined frame of mind, despite the circumstances. It uses location to demonstrate that Harry and co are not about to let what seems like fate play out. They are going to defy the pre-established order. To backtrack a bit here, I don't have too much to say about the climax other than gushing about some excellent shots once again. I mentioned Gambon's great acting before, and he helps project the fight here into one of the series' most memorable moments through the sheer iconic imagery of Dumbledore setting all of the Inferi to flame. The dialogue between Malfoy and Dumbledore prior to the death scene is a bit clunky and strange, not really following any coherent train of logical progress, but the moment of Dumbledore's death is good. The delivery of Dumbledore's Severus Please line is spot on from Gambon, and Rickman nails it once again. What steals the show, however, is the sequence after it. As opposed to the book, the aftermath of Dumbledore's death is not some huge battle, but a morbid wind down, as the Death Eaters take their leave of Hogwarts, leaving it in ruins. Some have postulated that omitting this battle was a poor move, and it does have a small negative knock-on effect for the next film, but it's undoubtedly a choice that is tonally consistent. Snape's reveal of being the Half-Blood Prince is shallower than it was in the books, simply because this film did not dwell on the mystery as much, but all in all, these moments are wonderfully shot and full of weight. It is genuinely heartbreaking to see Malfoy's face as Bellatrix completely destroys the Great Hall that he had so many happy memories in. And it's a symbolic gesture too. The happy times are completely gone. Hogwarts is destroyed. There is no joy or magic left here. But it is almost immediately countered by a pretty great moment as they cast out the Dark Mark, proving that evil has not yet won. Dumbledore's death is given so much gravity, and Hogwarts refuses to give in to honor his memory. Very clearly, Half-Blood Prince is about finding the tiny joys of life and persevering in the face of darkness, valuing existence, no matter how short that existence may be. It's similar to Order of the Phoenix, but tackles this in a less personal, more symbolic, and grand way to ramp up the stakes. It's a beautiful, ominous, lyrical piece that expresses its messages quite effectively. Apart from Prisoner of Azkaban, it is comfortably the film that adapted its book most creatively, and used the medium to its advantage to create a work that integrated tone, theming, and atmosphere seamlessly. Though it struggles a bit in terms of adapting certain plot points, realizing certain elements as well as possible, and proper prioritization, it is a character-driven piece that nails the big moments and offers a calm before the storm. And it does its utmost to ensure that the magic and charm were well and truly gone from the series, that the characters were grown and ready for what was to come, and that it was finally time for an all-out war. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. The seventh and final book finished 10 years after the first to put a cap on this beloved series. Rowling pulled out all the stops with this one, plunging the audience into a world of conspiracy, manipulation, corruption, and brand new lore to make this arguably the most self-contained story in the series. With the secret of the Horcruxes revealed, Harry, Ron, and Hermione must take on a perilous quest to find and destroy them to stop Voldemort, as the world continues to suffer under the spreading influence of the Death Eaters. Predictably, for such a varied mishmash of many ideas, at times it didn't all mesh together perfectly, but it did reach an action-packed, emotionally charged, epic finale. Early on, the decision was made in production to cut this into 2 films. Cynics stated that this was a cash grab, but anyone with any common sense could see why this was a good idea. Not only was there simply too much ground to cover to cram into one film while still providing a well-paced, effective experience, but the entire thing can be divided into 2 separate acts in terms of approach in the way they did it. They made a mistake by not dividing Goblet of Fire, but this was definitely the right call here. In terms of casting, Bill Nighy is great in his minor role as Rufus Scrimgeour, Peter Mullen is decent as Yaxley, and Nick Moran is surprisingly charismatic and charming in his role as Scabior, adding a unique element of flirtatious energy to the character. It's a great interpretation of what was a pretty bland minor character in the books, and it adds flair and intrigue to all of the scenes he's in. Domhnall Gleeson was serviceable as Bill Weasley, though we'll get into some issues with his character in a minute. Andy Linden plays Mundungus Fletcher, who should have been introduced in Order of the Phoenix. He's a bit of a weightless random in this film due to how he seemingly spouts out of nowhere, but Linden does quite well in his portrayal. And lastly, we have Rhys Ifans as Xenophilius Lovegood, Luna's father. He's great in the role, showing off that classic detached Lovegood charm while genuinely being pretty sympathetic and scary when the occasion calls for it. It's easy for lighter characters to maintain that energy when they shouldn't, but Ifans is able to expertly remove his layers and get down to the deep anxiety that his character feels. In contrast to the pulsating nature of the book, this film takes a subtle approach similar to Half-Blood Prince. Now, of course, due to the sheer amount of big moments and action, it isn't quite as quiet as Half-Blood Prince, but there is a clear parallel in approach to once again bring out the most of the actors and build a flow and emotional resonance. This film needed to explore and develop the characters, and these moments go a long way towards doing that. However, though it still continues to favor lots of still and lingering shots for the same reasons as Half-Blood Prince does, there is a notable increase in unsteadiness and movement of the camera for the occasions that called for it. Mainly scenes of extreme tension and drama, or action sequences. It is not quite as robotic and cold as its predecessor was in most of the scenes apart from the burrow attack, and there is a humanized element as well. The direction and cinematography here is phenomenal. A joint effort by Yates and new cinematographer Eduardo Serra, the medium is used to its greatest extent here, and this is quite possibly the most impressive thing about this entry. Some of these shots are among the best in the series, easily up there with Half-Blood Prince and Prisoner of Azkaban, as the ones that truly say something subtextually and symbolically without words. Long-distance shots are used quite often to both show off the beautiful landscapes, display the scope of this task, and demonstrate the isolation of the trio in a world that seems so big that it could swallow them up. Even the more commonplace shots are done with an innate sense of emotional context and occasion that makes them more visually interesting and engaging than they would have been otherwise. This film is a treat to look at. The color palette is a little dark and muted, but it is nowhere near as dull as Half-Blood Prince. It has this ever so slightly gray filter that is impressionable enough to be impacted by the context of each scene to portray the appropriate visual tone. But it should be noted that this is not a dull gray, rather a serene shade to accentuate the poetic flow of the work. In scenes of energy and happiness, bright, bold colors are tinted by this gray. In scenes of quiet reflection, natural blues and browns are ever so slightly tinged by gray. Atmospheric, wintry moments are grayish blue or white, and in moments of isolation, tension, or danger, the gray takes the forefront. Note that this is subtle, and there are exceptions to the rule where there is no sense of gray present to display a contextual contrast, but it is a noticeable pattern that ties the film together visually and provides it with an identity while being subtle enough to let scenes speak for themselves. It's much less blunt of an approach than the color palettes of Order of the Phoenix or Half-Blood Prince. If I had to describe the direction and cinematography here, it would be a style somewhere in between Prisoner of Azkaban and Half-Blood Prince. Not nearly constantly moving, but with enough flow so that there is much more progression felt than in Half-Blood Prince. It is a great balance that is found here, one that plays into the progression of the plot. These characters are not dwelling on their situation in the same way, and time is not at a standstill. It is undeniably moving, brutal and steady, and they have no idea where to go. This plays into the feeling of hopelessness, loneliness, and anxiety that plagues the majority of the film. If I had to refer to the season metaphor that I used when describing the first three, Deathly Hallows Part 1 is like a cold, dry, late autumn afternoon. arid and chilling, much less playful than the earlier autumn feel that defines Azkaban. The importance of Hogwarts is more palpable than ever before through its absence, and really makes the trio feel aimless, lost, and vulnerable. Their isolation really sets in after the wedding, where they take refuge at the House of Black, and it hardly lets up after that. Given the vaguest of instructions, these days of travel across these British landscapes are plagued with negativity. And make no mistake, these regions are gorgeously realized and shot, but there is a distinct contrast between the visual appeal of these landscapes and how our characters are feeling. As an outsider, we can see the beauty of these locales, but the characters are too miserable to take it all in, and it really drives home their frustration. These scenes across the countryside are among the most well-realized parts of the film, just drenched with atmosphere and this hopeless tone that gradually begins to reach a boiling point. The sound design brilliantly plays into this as well, being minimalistic but immersive. Whether it be the Horcrux sound, or an ambient, foreboding track, or the radio listing out the names of the recently deceased, this is extremely bleak and evocative. These segments are essential to the intent of the film, to make this journey incredibly frustrating early on so that the gratification of its completion is optimized. New composer Alexandre Desplat plays into this feeling quite well, doing what Goblet of Fire didn't, ramping up the impact of scenes through booming, rhythmic pieces, but balancing them with nuance so that these moments have more weight. On a related note, the film's audio design is fantastic, and apart from the bits that I already mentioned, it knows exactly where to add weight to scenes through silence and lack of soundtrack. Now, apart from my take on the cinematography, directing, and tone, my opinion of the film's quality all in all is very positive but mixed. The high points are absolutely amazing, but the lows are pretty bad. What's important to distinguish here is that a lot of these problems are problems that started earlier on in the series, but for which the full ramifications are only felt now that the series is concluding. So while I will be critical of certain story points here, know that I am not solely blaming the Deathly Hallows Part 1 for these problems. A lot of these are a negative, cascading domino effect that started earlier, and I will mention this. Regarding these story points, I think a critique and overview of this film specifically works best in discussing story events as they happen, so this movie will be done more or less chronologically. Note that in order to comment on the quality and execution of scenes, I will have to do some retelling and summarizing of the story. The opening to this film, and by that I mean the first 10 minutes or so, is absolutely fantastic. The Warner Brothers logo sets up the mood beautifully. Whereas it had been steadily growing darker as the films went on, here it is literally decaying as the screeching of a Horcrux steadily grows louder in the background. Bill Nighy's speech is epic, and adds weight to the film right from the off, and the subsequent montage of the trio preparing for their journey is brilliant. Ron's scene clearly shows his perceived isolation from his family due to his quest, and the Dursleys leaving their home is ironically quite poignant in spite of how terrible they are. They have never been a true mainstay in the films, but them leaving is symbolic of a dismissal of the familiar, a goodbye to nostalgia. We do miss out on a nice little character arc and a good moment for Dudley here, but it's an understandable omission as it would have broken the great flow of the scene. However, Emma Watson is the true star here, with a very emotional showing as she eliminates her parents' memories of her for their safety. Desplat's track is sweeping and emotional, the acting here is spot on, and overall this opener is a brilliant way to adapt to the early tone of the story. The camera is nearly constantly panning, not extremely dynamic, but enough to give an ebb and flow to these scenes, a sense of momentum. The title card flashes by and we join Snape during a meeting with the Death Eaters, which, once again, is a great directorial choice. Establishing the villains here is a welcome reminder of the stakes and what they are capable of, and it is definitely beneficial to see Voldemort again so quickly after him more or less taking a vacation for Half-Blood Prince. This scene very quickly establishes how far the reach of the Death Eaters has spread, while ever so slightly hinting at a bit of complexity behind the unmoving black eyes of Severus Snape. Rafe Fiennes does well here, and the sheer amount of fear displayed by the Death Eaters through this shot adds an aura of power to him that really hadn't been established previously. He actually seems rather scary in this scene. That aura would dissipate as we move on through this story, but it works great here. One last point to note is the state of the Malfoys. They are disgraced, cowardly, disheveled, and pathetic. Jason Isaacs is great at showing the totally fragile state that his family is in, and this is a terrific establishment of where they are situated without really using clunky exposition. We then cut back to Harry, looking through this mirror that no non-book reader will have a clue about. This is an important plot point, but the decision to basically just skip any explanation here is pretty baffling. That aside, it is genuinely sobering to see number 4 Privet Drive, the place that was the site of so many dramatic events in the series, completely empty. This really hits home as Harry takes a glance at his old army men, a nice little nod to the scene of him in Philosopher's Stone playing with his toys. It's a lovely little moment that really foreshadows just how lonely this film will feel at times. From here, a couple of problems crop up, starting with the introduction of Bill Weasley. As I mentioned earlier, Bill was supposed to be introduced into the story as early as Goblet of Fire. He had a minor but active role throughout Order of the Phoenix, where he had taken up a desk job at Gringotts for the Order, and this role continued into Half-Blood Prince. He met Fleur around the beginning of Order of the Phoenix and proposed to her after the climax of that story, and a minor plot thread in Half-Blood Prince is how Fleur had begun integrating with the Weasley family, and how Mrs. Weasley and Ginny did not approve of her. At the climax of the story, during the Battle of Hogwarts, Bill, who had been tasked with protecting the school, was attacked by Fenrir Greyback so viciously that his face was mangled and permanently damaged. It is a sad moment, as this is a character that the reader had grown to know and like, but arguably the most important point here is that after Mrs. Weasley laments that he was about to be married, Fleur declares that she loves him for the person he is, not what he looks like. Mrs. Weasley, who assumed their relationship was built on physical attraction, is surprised and touched, and the two women reconcile. It's a nice little arc. However, it's completely pointless and does not work here. There's no emotional weight, it's shallow, and it has the feeling of a plot point that was only put in the movie as a sort of obligation to be loyal to the books. It's a minor complaint in the context of this film, but something I would consider to be a pretty notable failing of the films as a whole. There was the potential for a really good, emotional minor plot thread, and I get that it was omitted, but including the point about the scar has literally no impact on the story. We don't care about Bill as a film viewer, so we don't care about his injury, especially as we didn't see it happen. A good portion of viewers probably didn't even know who Fenrir Greyback was due to his lame portrayal in Half-Blood Prince. We're just half-heartedly told that Bill likes his steaks rare now, due to the absence of the prior material, and we are meant to assume that these two randomly got together. There is no narrative merit to their relationship, and it's clear that they're only in here because we needed a reason for the wedding to happen. It's lazy and shows a lack of long-term planning on the part of the films. This planning issue is immediately compounded in a line directly after this. After Lupin makes the steak comment, Tonks immediately says,
"My husband, the Joker. By the way, wait till you hear the news. Remus and I..."
Right, we'll have time for a cozy catch-up later.
Not only is this very unnatural, forced, clumsy expositing in contrast to the organic way they do it in the Death Eater scene, but once again, due to the relationship between Remus and Tonks being dumbed down here, there is very little point to this. These two undergo a pretty interesting relationship dynamic throughout Half-Blood Prince. Tonks has feelings for Lupin, and he reciprocates them, but he does not feel like he deserves her due to his condition, and his insecurities hold him back from committing to a relationship. Eventually, they're able to work through that and become a couple, and Tonks is pregnant at the beginning of Deathly Hallows, which is what she was about to say here. It's a nice, fitting dynamic that adds extra dimensions to both characters. This embrace of love from the both of them makes it more tragic when they're killed, compounded by the fact that they had a young child. But in the films, there is nothing to their relationship, and them having a kid is only functional as a means for the audience to feel conceptually sad about the idea of a kid's parents dying. It's much more one-dimensional than in the books, where the characters have more depth, and that child represents their willingness to embrace a life of happiness, contextual to their relationship. Again, this isn't solely a problem in this film, as much of a failure to fulfill the potential starting from Goblet of Fire. The sequence after this is pretty great. There is genuine urgency to the rescue, and the occasion feels very tense. Mundungus's introduction and the weird interjection of an out-of-place, sentimental moment with Hagrid are a couple of weak little bits of execution, but it's minor and nothing to ruin the scene. The 360-degree swivel capturing the cast in the midst of the transformation is a clever, funny, and wonderful bit of direction, and Radcliffe does a great job in capturing the personalities of the different characters who have become Harry. The chase scene afterwards is good, and Hedwig's death is a sad moment, but the scene immediately after this is better. You can just feel the tension as everyone waits, each second feeling like an eternity, for more loved ones to arrive, hoping that they aren't dead. The scene where Lupin ensures that Harry isn't an imposter is extremely well acted, but I find it strange that the question he asks him was about an occasion that we never see in the films. Most film-only watchers probably wouldn't even know what a Grindylow is, let alone that Harry saw one in Lupin's office. That aside, this is great, complete with some good character moments and a heavy beat with George's injury. It's actually pretty shocking to see the twins not all lighthearted and funny, and Bill's declaration that Mad-Eye is dead is awkward and blunt in the best way, delivering a hammer blow to proceedings. Immediately after, we're shown a film-exclusive scene where Harry tries to run away and Ron stops him. I really like this. It shows the burden that's weighing on Harry as he sees all of his loved ones continuously get hurt for him, but Ron reminds both him and the audience of the scale of the journey, that it's much bigger than any one person, before ending with his questioning of where the hell they start searching. There's a notable use of a handheld camera to humanize the moment. It's a great tone setter, and it gets into the heads of these characters really well, which is essential for a work that will so heavily focus on the main trio. While I have criticized the approach used with Ron in the series so far, I'm really glad that Rupert Grint was given this scene to show his stuff early on, and it was an indication that the Deathly Hallows would break out of the limited utility of Ron that Half-Blood Prince tended to adhere to. We then go to a cringy Harry-Ginny scene on the morning of the wedding. Bonnie Wright is wooden yet again, and there isn't any chemistry once again. But I do love George's interjection.
Morning.
After a cool establishing shot of the Burrow in preparation for the wedding, Scrimgeour pays the trio a visit to give them what Dumbledore left them in his will. It is a nuanced and very nice section, and it takes a leaf out of Half-Blood Prince's book by using those still, lingering shots to draw out organic reactions from the actors. It's very atmospheric, almost serene, due to the music and gravity of the occasion, and it's pervaded by a tiny sense of nostalgia due to the snitch. Shortly after, the little bit of the wedding we see is decent. The set design is wonderful as always, and it's very nice to see some characters from past films once again. The introduction of Xenophilius Lovegood is very good and establishes his character right away, and the little chats Harry has with Elphias Doge and Aunt Muriel are okay. The scenes themselves are fine, but they once again are the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper plot line than what is portrayed in the film. The slow uncovering of Dumbledore's true past is one of the major points of the book, and it goes a long way towards humanizing the man and adding layers to his character. There's quite a lot of depth covered here in the books about his brother and sister, his childhood, his trials growing up, and how he became the man he became. However, all we get here are vague mentions of a scandal and how Dumbledore kept lots of secrets. I feel like this scene's intent was to bring up the fact that Bathilda Bagshot lives in Godric's Hollow more than anything else, which is too bad. The interruption of the wedding and the declaration that the Death Eaters had taken over the Ministry is well done. Kingsley Shacklebolt's voice is chilling, the stakes are once again brought up, and the panic is palpable immediately as the trio escape. I'm not a big fan of the fight in the coffee shop, but it does conclude with a nice little Ron-Hermione moment, and Emma Watson's acting is once again terrific, as she is forced to use the spell that she used on her parents earlier. A lovely bit of atmospheric directing is achieved as the trio return to the House of Black. After entering and dealing with the security measure put up, there is a near deafening silence as the desolation of the house creeps in, and it really brings home the isolation.
We're alone.
There is another nice romantic nod to Ron and Hermione as we see that the two were likely holding hands before they fell asleep. The atmosphere in the House of Black is great. It's a refuge from the danger, a safe haven, but due to the anxiety that they feel for their loved ones, and due to the acknowledgement that they have tons of work to do, this stillness is an uncomfortable one. But that tone is soon broken through the discovery of Kreacher and the revelation that Mundungus is the only lead they have to start their journey. Energy is immediately ramped up as we cut to goings-on throughout the wizarding world. Hogwarts is being tampered with, Harry is being searched for, the Ministry has been reformed and taken over by the Death Eaters, and the world is not in good shape. There are some nice little touches in the Ministry scene as we can see some of the characters who we will come to know very soon. But most importantly for the trio, Mundungus is caught. It's a great little segment that adds some much-needed scope and pace to the flow of the story. And after a 5-film absence, Dobby is back. I'll talk about him later. While it isn't terrible, the infiltration of the Ministry is a bit messy. The main problem here is that throughout the sequence, the dubbing implementation broke immersion constantly. Because the original actors' voices are used to dub over the people they're disguised as, the actors had to mime their lines with a disconnected idea of how they would be delivered. This is very clear throughout, and some bad cases of wooden lip flapping and strained delivery really take the viewer out of the experience.
I'd say if we don't locate Umbridge within the hour, we go find Ron and come back another day. Deal?
Yes.
That said, I do really like how stiff and uncomfortable Harry is here. He's very unaccustomed to his new body, and that's clear with the way he walks. Umbridge is good once again, and the bit with Ron and that dude's wife is funny. The escape from the Ministry leads to one of the most impressive parts of the film, and the sequence that leaves the biggest tonal impression here as I described before. I won't dwell on them too much, as I already waxed lyrical about them when talking about the tone and directing, but I need to draw attention to this ingeniously executed scene between Hermione and Scabior to naturally demonstrate how the protective enchantments work. And what also should be noted is Ron's growing frustration and internal pain as he begins to get jealous of Harry and Hermione, culminating with the emotionally charged fight between them. Rupert Grint does really well with this, genuinely looking very scary in a couple of scenes, and the film is impacted almost immediately by his absence. Without words, it's communicated extremely bluntly what the emotional energy is like here. Through even more isolated framing, Hermione's more submissive behavior, and some very intentional loud silence, Ron's absence speaks volumes. These two are not in a good place. So Harry, the awkward guy that he is, tries to cheer up one of the most important people in the world to him through a little dance. Now, this is a little bit of a contentious scene that is pretty divisive, but I personally love it. It's funny, it's sweet, it's awkward, and it's just Harry doing the best that he can to cheer Hermione up. It's a tiny ray of light in a dark, dark story, but it never goes too far into the light. The best part for me personally is right at the end, where after a long glance, Hermione turns away, a serious look on her face. This does two things. First, it eliminates and dismisses any hints of a romantic connection between the two, and second, it drives home the reality of the situation. Things are not suddenly solved by this, and after their quick moment of respite, nothing has changed. They're both still miserable. It's very real. Soon after, the two decide to travel to Godric's Hollow to find Bathilda Bagshot, which signals the beginning of my favorite sequence in the film. The atmosphere is instantly changed when the two arrive in Godric's Hollow. It is snowy and cold, but there is automatically something softer and warmer about this. The shuffling of their footsteps being muffled by snow, the distant sounds of celebrations in a pub, the singing in the church. In contrast to the trailer parks, the beautiful but desolate landscapes, and the cold, hard rocks that they camped out on before, this is a place of comfort. It really drives home how long they've been away from others, how much they've lost, how much they miss others, and how much this journey is weighing on them. But at the same time, it also drives home why they're doing what they're doing in the first place, so that Christmas Eves like this can continue forever.
Do you think they'd be in there, Hermione? My mum and dad?
Yeah, I think they would.
The discovery of Harry's parents' grave is genuinely very beautiful. While we know that Emma Watson has the emotional material down pat, it's easy to see how far Daniel Radcliffe has come in terms of portraying grief. It's not forced at all, and it feels incredibly organic and real, so much so that I wouldn't be surprised if he was actually tearing up due to the sheer emotion of the scene. Accompanied by Duplass's painfully beautiful track of mourning, the scene swells as the emotions fester until it pans to show a figure in the distance, and all of the warmth of the moment suddenly vanishes. After a scuffle with Nagini, the two travel to the Forest of Dean, probably the most gorgeous location in the film, and move on to the discovery of the sword and the return of Ron, where, as I said, Rupert Grint finally gets some more interesting material. It's a nice scene where he conquers his insecurities and destroys the Horcrux. In subsequent moments, I love how coldly Hermione acts towards him and how he sucks up to her in response. I'm personally a huge fan of the little animation that they use to illustrate the Deathly Hallows story. Though it ends up being true, this is meant to be a children's fable, so showing it in a realistic style would not really fit the tone. It's got the feel of a Tim Burton film. Very abstract and quirky, with an undercurrent of darkness to define it. The chase scene that occurs after this is one of the high points of the film. Sound design is again great, as the panic of the occasion sets in. Lack of music is once again evident, and all you can hear for a good portion is the sounds of the rapid footsteps and the harsh breaths of the runners. There is a great panning shot of the entire thing to punctuate some pretty shaky camera work used to display how chaotic this encounter is. But after they've been captured and Hermione transfigures Harry's face, we reach arguably the worst executed section. And it's a shame to say that about the climax, but it's just not very good. First, however, Harry once again sees a vision of Voldemort. I don't really like this little scene because the entire way through, the impression is that Grindelwald is mocking Voldemort, that he has the upper hand because the wand is with Dumbledore. And while this may be true, I don't think it's advisable to have the main villain look so unimpressive. He should have stomped on, dominated, and exerted his power over Grindelwald, because that is who he is. But this really isn't an impressive or threatening way to get information from someone.
Tell me, Grindelwald, tell me where it is. Tell me who possesses it.
It sort of breaks the powerful aura established in the beginning. It can be argued that this is to show his panic, which is fair, but why even establish this aura in the first place if it is going to be broken without much happening in between? This aura being broken does not have any weight if it is not carried out in a narratively powerful way. The trio are then taken to Malfoy Manor, and we are reminded again of how disgraced the Malfoys are. After Bellatrix loses it after seeing the sword, she does away with the Death Eaters, puts Harry and Ron in the cellar along with Luna, Ollivander, and Griphook, and keeps Hermione with her to try to torture information out of her. And from here, things get pretty sloppy. What is extremely effective is the tiny bit of torture that is witnessed and implied. Emma Watson's screams are terrible to hear, and the sounds of her kicking the wooded floor and struggling desperately are genuinely disturbing. But Ron's reaction to it is extremely disappointing, knowing what it could have been. In the books, he is inconsolable, screaming and crying for Hermione, completely incapable of formulating a plan and focusing on anything other than trying desperately to get to her. He is a liability, and it makes total sense. But here, all we get is...
We have to do something.
This is an adaptation with liberties taken, but this really falls flat given that the blueprint for a much superior scene was in the text. There is then a tiny little bit of Luna humor that falls kind of flat. It works tonally better in the books, and I don't really think it should have been adapted with Hermione screaming in the background, but it's not really a problem. Harry calls for help through the mirror, Wormtail takes Griphook, and then Dobby appears. I didn't enjoy the joke with Luna, but I particularly like the couple of little lines with Dobby here. But afterwards, it's almost like they try to compensate for the lack of Dobby in the previous films by making him endearing, likable, funny, cute, and brave all within a few minutes, so that the audience falls in love with him again to increase the impact of the inevitable dagger blow. It completely changes the tonality of the climax for the worse. Dobby then tells Harry and Ron to meet him at the top of the stairs in 10 seconds, and Wormtail stupidly walks in, Dobby hits him with a spell from behind, and all is well. This scene is severely dumbed down from how it was in the books, where Wormtail's metal hand literally strangles him to death, despite Harry and Ron's best efforts, as a consequence of him hesitating after Harry reminds him of the life debt he owes him due to saving his life in Prisoner of Azkaban. This leads to a strangely conflicting, very heavy moment of reflection for both Harry and Ron in the books, and a bunch of nothing happens in this adaptation. To be completely fair, this is another domino effect due to earlier adaptation omissions, and some of the fault lies with Prisoner of Azkaban because it didn't really properly establish that Wormtail had such a life debt to Harry. Having said that though, this comical is bad. I personally think that this would have been much better if Dobby had been introduced at an earlier point, and if the situation was approached with a much more desperate and urgent tone. Dobby would have had no need to re-endear himself to the audience through these actions, and internal consistency and believability would be intact. Anyways, the tension ramps up again as Harry and Ron ascend the stairs to try and save Hermione. Ron has a nice line as he runs in to stop Bellatrix, there's a quarrel for a bit, the two are subdued, Bellatrix finally sees that this is Harry and instructs someone to call Voldemort using the Dark Mark. But the tension is broken as Dobby noisily unscrews the chandelier and everyone looks up at him comically. A solid 10 seconds are spent where the entire room looks up at Dobby. Lucius decides that calling Voldemort to capture Harry is less important than looking at his former house elf for 10 seconds, Narcissa does nothing, and Bellatrix just stands there under the chandelier that is about to fall down. It's weird. Chaos ensues from this. Lucius decides that now, in the midst of battle, is a better time to call Voldemort than before, and eventually the group huddles together. Instead of apparating away immediately, the group just stands there, breathing heavily, as Dobby makes a dumb joke in the time that could have been used to be apparating away. Bellatrix retorts, and Dobby replies with a cheesy, heartfelt speech that feels incredibly contrived and out of place, as Bellatrix politely waits for him to finish before trying to kill him. I'm not against this speech being here, but it should have been presented in a more believable way. It's poor writing to expect the audience to believe that one of the most dangerous murderers in the setting stood there and patiently, politely waited before trying to kill the literal most important enemies of her master. I did not make a big deal about the logical inconsistencies in Prisoner of Azkaban, because those were minor problems that serviced the narrative and themes, but these are quite debilitating. It could be argued that the narrative is benefited in a way by these things, by making Dobby a lively and likable character, but that is due to the comparatively lower quality precedent set as a result of not being efficient in storytelling throughout the series to make these moments stick without overcompensating. Nearly 40 seconds were spent standing there in the time that could have been spent getting away, and when the fatal blow is something that only landed in the tiniest of split seconds, the finest of margins, it actually ends up being unintentionally pretty hilarious. I understand the thinking here, but it really doesn't work in a situation where the stakes are so high. It breaks the immersion, strains believability, and is completely out of character for Bellatrix and Lucius. The group arrives at the seaside cottage and Harry realizes that Dobby has been fatally injured. It's a good scene, well composed, shot, and acted. Dobby's gasps for air are especially good, and Harry's helplessness is really heartbreaking. But the impact is dulled somewhat, because despite being compensated for in the climax, Dobby is hardly a feature in the series other than in Chamber of Secrets. It's yet another byproduct and snowball effect of a series of prioritization issues throughout. Yet, the burial scene is beautifully shot again, and the film ends after cutting to a quite epic, very ominous and threatening scene as Voldemort robs the corpse of Dumbledore and finally obtains the strongest wand in the world. It is extremely powerful, greatly adapted, and a fantastic way to end the film and set up Part 2. Deathly Hallows Part 1 is, artistically at the very least, a supremely made film. It excels in cinematography, sound design, theming, tone, and atmosphere. Some individual sequences throughout it are among the best in the series, and it is paced quite well. The main two knocks against it are the pretty frequent problems or bits of missed potential throughout, and the fact that it is very clearly one half of a story, a contributor to a greater whole. The plot meanders and doesn't reach a gratifying conclusion, and the climax itself is incredibly disappointing for the reasons I pointed out. But if one looks at this as one half of a 4.5-hour conclusion to the series, as I think one should, then it does damn well for itself despite the problems. By now, we have done away with the major problems of the weaker entries of the series, those being a lack of creative ambition and cohesion, terrible pacing, and poor character exploration, and ultimately, Deathly Hallows 1 provides a very good platform for the series to finally deliver an emotionally satisfying, definitive finale. Deathly Hallows 2 is pretty interesting stylistically for a number of reasons. One would imagine that, due to this film essentially being one gigantic battle, Yates would have forsaken the low-key approach that he used in the previous two films because this portion of the story doesn't really seem to lend itself to that style. But interestingly enough, he sticks with it here. The lingering shots are still here, and the wide, still frames are as well in the non-battle scenes. Eduardo Serra returns for this, and he is as brilliant as ever, perhaps even better than he was in Part 1. The landscapes are mostly gone, but he is able to maintain the beautiful cinematography through marvelous work with the Hogwarts castle and the surrounding areas. Much focus is put on the viaduct entrance of the castle, the bridge and entrance that leads to the entrance and great halls, which is a great touch not only because it's an area that we have hardly spent any time with in films prior, but because it's simply a great stage for these action set pieces. We also see a couple of new areas in the boathouse and some sort of huge staircase, both of which serve as platforms for huge moments. In terms of interconnectivity, it is made very clear where the viaduct entry and boathouse are with relation to the rest of the castle, though I'm not entirely sure where the huge staircase is. It might have actually completely replaced the grand staircase in terms of location, which is, to be completely fair, an inconsistency. I don't really have a problem with it though, as I don't think that a lot of these scenes would have quite worked in the same way on the narrow grand staircase. Regardless, Serra uses these locations to their utmost, with lots of centralized shots, using nearly symmetrical parts of the castle to demonstrate the sheer uniformity and submission of the students under their new rule, the totality of Hogwarts' defeat. The new staircase area and the viaduct entrance are particularly useful here. In general, a ton of the castle is used in great shots throughout to not only show the wide scale of the battle and communicate these themes, but to give one last hurrah and goodbye to the most important aspect of the setting. Additionally, there are so many terrific little shots throughout to tell the most intimate of stories, the tiny moments these people share together before laying their lives on the line. It is fantastic from start to finish. The color palette and softness remain, giving this film a tone identical to Part 1, but applying it to a much different story so that the thematic context is alternated. Whereas Part 1 was all about digging into character mentality, anxiety, and directionless desperation, this film is like a somber, flowing requiem that explores the different motivations that people adhere to defend and protect what they love. Almost otherworldly in its beauty, ebbing and flowing, gradually building up to a crescendo, and then silence, peace and quiet before the final goodbye. It's not overly loud, it's a grand epic. Desplat's work on Part 1 was very good, but this score is on another level. It's consistently optimally paced, adding to scenes and being able to stand on its own as a great piece while not being too extravagant and taking away from the moments. And in Lily's theme, he crafts a haunting, beautiful song that ends up being the core identity of Part 2, an iconic track that is up there with John Williams' most celebrated work in the series. This all forms a poetic action film in approach, which is quite unique. And though it does have some problems, it is a great demonstration of how to correct everything Goblet of Fire did wrong. It is an action-packed story with too much content and character focus to fit into one film, so the wise decision was made to split it. It balances out thrilling action with levity and character moments for proper flow, and uses atmosphere and cinematography to its advantage to make the biggest moments hit hard. This is how to properly make Harry Potter into an action thriller. Now, if you couldn't tell already, my opinion on Part 2 is exceedingly positive. I think this is a great film, and a very satisfying conclusion to the saga, and I do love the many things it does well. But for the sake of balance, I'm going to talk first about my problems with the adaptation before diving into the many things that it does so well. To start off, there were a couple of plot details that were executed really strangely. The first occurs after the school is retaken, when Professor McGonagall orders that the entire Slytherin house be taken to the dungeons, after Pansy Parkinson says that they should hand Harry over. In the books, the sequence of events is a bit more nuanced, but here it is clear that the entire house is being punished because of the actions of one student, regardless of whether or not those Slytherins wanted to help the cause, and regardless of whether or not they shared the same sentiment as Parkinson. It's pretty dumb. Secondly, after Ron and Hermione realize that they must get the Basilisk Fangs to destroy the Horcruxes, Ron speaks Parseltongue to open the chamber because Harry speaks Parseltongue in his sleep so often that Ron was able to learn a snake language. And luckily, the words Harry said were the exact ones needed to open the Chamber of Secrets. This is unbelievably stupid, and the film almost acknowledges this through Hermione's reaction. Also, Voldemort's awkward mannerisms come full force in this film. Though his look never really sold me, Voldemort had a decent entrance in Goblet of Fire, then a pretty weak showing in Order of the Phoenix, followed by a decent appearance in Part 1. He does have really great stuff. For instance, the way he just kills Thickness out of annoyance is great, his murder of Snape is ruthlessly done, and his come to die line is delivered really well, but he just never feels as threatening as he should for the reasons I said in Goblet of Fire's critique. He allows Neville to give a speech, he really awkwardly hugs Draco, he has those cheesy laughs. It just never really worked for me, but I won't harp on it. Now, this film is where we see the snowball effect of the approach to Ron and Hermione's characterization in full, and it all culminates in one moment. Harry tells his two best friends in the world that he is going to die. Hermione's reaction is phenomenal, full of emotion, tears, a heartfelt hug, but Ron does nothing but look at Harry silently. I get it, and we do see grief. Ron is the understated, quiet type. He's shocked and confused. He's just lost a brother. But 7 years of intense friendship, experiencing so much together, so many highs and lows to form such a strong bond, and he doesn't have a thing to say? I was waiting for Ron to do something, to scream in agony, to fall to his knees, to give Harry a hug, to do anything. And all he does is look back. Nothing to say to his best friend who is about to die. I don't like this scene, and I look at it as a representation of the misuse of Ron in the series. From there are just a few minor issues. Thankfully, a couple of really underbaked plot threads are put to bed here, as they sort of kind of explain the mirror, and the really shallow bit about Dumbledore's family concludes. As I described earlier, Tonks and Lupin dying doesn't hit anywhere near as hard as it should, and the iconic fight between Mrs. Weasley and Bellatrix is strange and underwhelming. After the famous line, Mrs. Weasley rises to spar with Bellatrix, while the rest of her family kind of just stand there and watch. I never understood why they don't try to attack here as well. Their mother and wife is at genuine risk of death, so why not intervene? I dunno, it's just strange. Apart from that, the conclusion is a bit too quick for my liking at the end too, and I would have liked a bit more closure. All of these characters who we've come to know are seen in conflicts, but no one is dwelt upon in the immediate aftermath except the trio. We're just given the briefest of glimpses at the cast, and it's a bit lacking. However, having said all of that, none of these problems really run the film off course, nor did they affect my experience much thanks to the other brilliant aspects throughout. The opening is an incredibly directed tone setter, using a quick flashback of Voldemort obtaining the Elder Wand and then fading into a gorgeous and ominous shot of the castle, surrounded by Dementors. The oppression of the students is immediately shown. The viaduct entrance is laid out right from the beginning as a location that we'll be visiting quite often, and we see the new headmaster watching on from above. The composition here very clearly establishing him as someone who will not only be prominent, but a person who is very much alone. Possibly internally tortured and alone. The entire thing is accompanied by the beautiful lilies theme that I mentioned, and it pulls all of it together beautifully. I don't really have much of anything to say about the introduction at the cottage and the break-in to Gringotts. They're both adequate and do the job, but honestly for me the movie really properly gets going after the escape from Gringotts. The flash to Voldemort laying siege is great, and it really captures how on edge and vulnerable he feels. I think it would have been more effective if he had more depth from Half-Blood Prince and seemed more sinister, but Ralph Fiennes does great here. The entire sequence is superbly directed, from the way there seems to be a hushed silence until Harry emerges from the water, to the constantly rotating shot of the trio discussing the next course of action as Ron continuously tries and continuously fails to get dressed. Kieran Hinds makes for a pretty great Aberforth as he takes in the trio to smuggle them into the castle. He strikes a great balance between being very clearly frustrated with the state of things, yet showing a bit of underlying hope in spite of his words. Neville comes to bring the trio to Hogwarts, and we're given another glimpse of the awesome camera work as we pan up from the secret underground tunnel to see a darkened, Dementor-guarded Hogwarts, to really emphasize Neville's words that the castle had changed. Matthew Lewis is good here in general, taking a much more robust role than ever before, and really finally coming into his own for the first time. And while we're on the subject, Kelly MacDonald is really good as Helena Ravenclaw, displaying a haunting regret through nearly every line she says. There's a really exceptional moment as she perfectly delivers probably her most profound line.
You remind me of him a bit.
It puts the moment on a standstill and offers some contemplation before diving into the battle. And prior to that battle, there is some really great stuff. The twins have a nice little moment of support, which really strikes deep given later events. And as I mentioned in Philosopher's Stone, Voldemort's speech is genuinely terrifying. The build-up to the battle is epic. McGonagall absolutely kills it, the statues are badass, a ton of minor characters get a little time to shine, and the barrier that they erect across the entire school just seems to emulate with this hype of the battle to come. There are also several little romantic moments between Ron and Hermione, bits where Ron uses Hermione's logic from the past to surprise her, where she says he's brilliant, or where he defends her. It's all really nice to see something that's been hinted at forever finally manifest. The actual main beats of the battle are a thing of beauty. It's not a loud, choppy, or blunt approach taken, but a very deliberate one. There are multiple flowing shots panning across the castle and surrounding areas to give a clear indication of the locations of the different battles and the states of those battles as we see Hogwarts in all its glory one last time. And the scene where the trio make their way over to the boathouse in the midst of all this is an encapsulation of this film's philosophy and approach. A flowing, moving painting of a battle. A microcosm of the chaos and different moving parts of this war. This sequence, combined with the next half hour or so, form arguably the best series of scenes in the series, partly due to Alan Rickman's absolute brilliance. Snape's death is brutal, as he bleeds out with Nagini relentlessly attacking, and with us and Harry put at the other side of the boathouse wall, it is powerful as all hell. The sound is all that's needed. Our minds are enough to fill in the gaps and make this maybe even more visceral than it would have been if we saw it. And finally, for the first time in the series, Snape breaks his facade and cries. It is extremely strange and a bit heartbreaking to know exactly what's going on in his head, and the mix of weakness and longing in his voice is spot on.
You have your mother's eyes.
Daniel Radcliffe really nails what this moment means for Harry. He doesn't quite know how to process what he's seen, and he's in complete shock. And this feeling of shock carries over as the casualties are discovered. The reveal of George's death is gut-wrenching, marvelously acted by all involved. It hits that sweet spot of grief between not putting too much focus on it to ensure that it doesn't outweigh the other deaths, but also putting enough emphasis for it to mean something more. And Harry can't look anymore. He goes up to the headmaster's quarters to look at what Snape meant to show him. The Prince's Tale is probably the most important chapter in the books, and easily the segment of the film that was most anxiously awaited and put under the most scrutiny by fans. Essentially an encapsulation and reveal of so many major secrets behind Dumbledore, Lily, Harry, and of course Snape. It had to be executed well here. It didn't matter if the rest of the film was great. If The Prince's Tale wasn't done justice, this adaptation would have failed in the eyes of many. And although there are a few things left out due to previous installments and creative liberties taken, I have nothing but total praise for this sequence. In terms of acting, cinematography, sound design, emotion, and the little touches throughout that pull it all together. The camera work here is shifting and distorted. Whether it be as major as the first scenes or as minor as the tiny shifts towards the end, attention is paid to make this montage feel extremely uncomfortable. After all, these memories are being shared by a man who is, more than anything, ashamed and full of regret. Even as the memories just start to form, we can hear glimpses of the dialogue that will come to pass. In a different time, a different place, and using a completely different visual style altogether, we see Lily demonstrating her magic to Petunia before being yelled at and called a freak. An awkward, slightly creepy-looking boy emerges from a nearby tree and offers an olive branch through showing his own magic to show Lily that she isn't a freak. Supplemented by some beautiful imagery and framing, we learn that these two developed a strong bond here. And as if we couldn't tell, the color palette and lighting tells its own story, that this was one of the happiest times of Snape's life. Perhaps the only happy time. But that immediately changes when the scene shifts to Hogwarts. It automatically gets darker and more tinged with the gray that we're used to, as Snape watches the girl he loves meet the boy she would grow to love, the boy who would make his life a living hell. The light comes back as we see scenes where Snape was spending time with Lily, but it immediately loses the vibrancy whenever a negative memory by Snape's perception comes into play. As audible echoes of Snape's insults to Harry's father permeate the scene, we begin to see why he hated him so. A massive time skip occurs, and we see that the two got married through that photo of them dancing that I love so much. I think that this would have benefited from a moment or two of the memories in Order of the Phoenix, or a new scene from their later years in Hogwarts, but I won't nitpick here. Trelawney's prophecy comes into play and seamlessly transitions into the birth of Voldemort from Goblet of Fire, as we see an absolutely distraught Snape begging Dumbledore to help protect the Potters. It is easily the most animated and emotional Snape has ever been, and as the deal between him and Dumbledore is established, we flow into Lily's heartbreaking last words to her son before her death, as subtle flashes of Philosopher's Stone and Prisoner of Azkaban integrate and refresh how things came to be this way. The Potters trusted the wrong man. Snape is inconsolable here, hardly able to talk coherently through his sobs. Given the emotion he shows here, it begins to click into place just how guarded he always appeared to be during his scenes, and most importantly, why there always seemed to be that lingering sadness in his eyes. After a subtle little snap and change of mentality after hearing that Harry has Lily's eyes, Snape agrees to protect him to honor her memory. Scenes flash by, lingering for just a second to provide context, but not too long to keep the momentum of this revelation gathering speed. We now begin intercutting two separate timelines. A micro one as we see Snape discovering the ruin of the Potter household after Voldemort's attack, and a macro one to show the progression through the series. As audio flashes of Snape's arguments with Harry in Order of the Phoenix play in one timeline, in the other we see him walk past James's corpse, not even sparing it a second glance. We move on to the issue of the ring in Half-Blood Prince, and the plan beginning to come into place to have Snape kill Dumbledore, as we see Malfoy's painful journey, hear his voice uttering the spells he used to try and fix the cabinet. It is supreme integration. Notably, right here, the music changes totally and completely, from a melancholic and sad but momentous, slightly mischievous piece to a full-out, orchestrated, choired lament. We are entering the most painful parts of Snape's life. The planned murder of Dumbledore, the knowledge that Harry must die for Voldemort to be defeated, learning of the death of the one thing that made his life worth living, and the resolve he put forth to express his love for her through protecting her legacy. The music and scenes build to a steady apex as Snape enters the room to find his worst fears realized. And the acting here, it speaks for itself. Everything was for Lily. His love for her ran so deep that he sacrificed his everything to carry out her will. He helped them find the sword, he protected Malfoy, he killed a man he cared for because he had to. And through sharing these painful memories with Harry, he ensures that his mission will be completed. It's a mosaic of so many beautiful little elements that come together gorgeously at the end. The bits of past dialogue, the scenes used from previous films, the dissolving flow from memory to memory, it is a story in and of itself, so full of emotional, narrative, and artistic merit. The Prince's Tale knocked it out of the park, and the stunned silence afterwards is the ideal reaction. Ignoring the terrible excuse for a farewell with Ron, on the way to his death, Harry almost instinctually realizes how to unlock the Resurrection Stone and finds himself face to face with 4 of the most important people in his life. It's beautifully done. Harry's hand phasing through his mother's is a painful touch, and the slight filter over the ghosts makes them just different enough to stand out. It's a really great scene, and it culminates with one of Fiennes' best deliveries in the series.
Come to die.
The realization of this pseudo-King's Cross inside Harry's head is awesome. It has just enough form to actually resemble the station, while also being so otherworldly and serene that it simply can't be of this world. Michael Gambon makes a great cameo, being the best Dumbledore he can be. The high-spirited, wise, strange old man. It's a shame that his story wasn't fleshed out, but he absolutely nails all of the important lines here. The climax itself is not as good, but serviceable. As I mentioned, though the bits of Voldemort flaunting make total sense for the character, I think it should have gone in a different direction. It's pretty cringy. But it all picks up after Harry reveals himself. Ron and Hermione screwing around with the fangs gets a bit old, but Neville has a nice moment and Harry and Voldemort's fight is decent enough, ending with the iconic imagery of 2 men, 2 wands, 2 beams of light, and 1 death. And the haunting melody of Lily's theme plays one more time to great effect here. The final goodbye to the series is cheesy, but I enjoyed it. I was never a big fan of how Harry named his son after the man who tortured him for 6 years for reasons out of Harry's control. I always thought that Harry would gain a respect and admiration for Snape's bravery, but naming his son after seems a bit much. Just a personal problem with the books here that they adapted in the film. The aging effects aren't bad, and it's very nostalgic to see these new first years traveling to Hogwarts for the first time, accompanied by Williams' classic score, almost inviting and tempting the audience to experience the series all over again. And with that, the journey is done. If I could describe this film series in one word, it would be evolution. From pure vibrant wonder to somber war, from uninspired direction to pure aesthetic artistic achievement, from innocence to adulthood. And though I frame these changes as drastic, the most important thing was that this was a gradual evolution, with the films changing subtly enough from entry to entry, such that you only realize how much they change once you compare films from nearly a decade apart. Each entry coming with its own weaknesses, its own strengths, and most importantly, its own contribution to the complexion of the series. In general, while I maintain that this series was successful, I think that the Harry Potter story does not lend itself optimally to the movie format. I think that a live-action TV series would be the opportunity to portray the stories at their best in a visual medium. One season of anywhere from 6 to 12 or so episodes per book, with the length being dictated by the depth and breadth of the book being adapted. This would allow for the more interesting side stories, a lot of which I mentioned, to be realized properly. From Hermione and SPEW, to doing proper justice to Goblet of Fire's plot, to the Centaur conflict in Order of the Phoenix. It would allow for more gradual, introspective character work, and most importantly for me, it would provide audiences with the most deliberate, comprehensive glimpse into the day-to-day life at Hogwarts, which is genuinely the most immersive and enjoyable thing about the books for me. Up on screen now is my ranking of the films of the series, from my favorite to least favorite, in comparison to my rankings of the books in the series, just for fun. If you've managed to get this far, I'd be delighted if you shared your rankings too and commented on some of my extremely opinionated musings throughout, if you feel the inclination. I had the hopes of trying to be honest, unbiased, and neutral, but inevitably, personal preference dictated a good portion of my critiques in this video, so no doubt that there are nearly an infinite amount of ways to look at the points I made throughout. I didn't notice half of the things, both positive and negative, that I pointed out here when I was a child watching the series, and I think that's part of the beauty of it. Depending on who you are, what you value in stories, and what you enjoy, you will find different things to like about the different films, and any other take is obviously just as valid as mine. The main point here is enjoyment and legacy. This film franchise will go down as one of the most celebrated of all time for the sheer amount of consistent effort that was constantly put in for 10 years straight. While the books understandably get more credit, the films I talked about here were a more than satisfactory realization of the universe, so much so that many cannot imagine Hogwarts being anything other than what was portrayed on film. Many can't read the books without the actors' voices in their heads. These films were able to capture the hearts and imaginations of countless, able to adapt one of the most iconic stories of all time into a franchise that excited and captivated. More than anything, they transmit the sheer spirit of Rowling's stories, and that transcends all. Thank you so much for watching.